Section 1. The beginning how Family Guy was born. So, let's go back to the very beginning. Not the beginning of the show exactly, but the beginning of the person who made it. Because when you trace the line back far enough, what you find is a young guy from Kent, Connecticut who was obsessed with cartoons and music and old movies, a kid who grew up drawing characters and writing jokes, and absolutely devouring everything that animated television had to offer. His name was Seth Woodbury MacFarlane, and from a very early age, he seemed to understand that comedy could be a kind of art. He was drawing his own comic strip by the time he was 9 years old. He sold it to his local newspaper, actually. A regular column. A kid, 9 years old. There's something almost disarmingly wholesome about that detail when you consider what he would go on to create. MacFarlane grew up as a genuine student of entertainment. He loved the big band era. He loved old Hollywood musicals. He loved classic animation and the kind of sharp, layered comedy that felt like it respected the audience. He had a sense of humor that ran on multiple tracks at once, something that would define his work throughout his career. When he was old enough, he enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the most respected art schools in the country, and it was there that everything started to take shape. In 1995, as part of his senior thesis at the Rhode Island School of Design, MacFarlane created a short animated film called The Life of Larry. The film followed a middle-aged, overweight, somewhat oblivious man named Larry and his loyal, intelligent dog named Steve. If you watch it today, and it does exist online, the resemblance to what would later become Family Guy is immediate. Larry and Steve were the rough sketches of Peter and Brian. The relationship was already there. The dynamic was already forming. The bumbling man with good intentions but terrible execution, paired with the wry, world-weary dog who could see exactly what was happening and had very little power to stop it. MacFarlane graduated and went to work at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio that had given the world the Flintstones and Yogi Bear and the Jetsons. He worked as a writer and animator on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. Good shows, solid work, respectable early career stuff. But he was clearly building towards something else. He made a follow-up short film called Larry and Steve, which continued developing those characters further. And then the moment came. The story of how Family Guy got to television is a little weirder than most people know. According to MacFarlane himself, his concept was originally pitched to Fox as a series of shorts that would run on Mad TV, the sketch comedy show that aired on the same network. The idea was to use the animation as short inserts between sketches, little bits of comedy woven into the broader show. But when Fox executives actually watched what MacFarlane had produced, they made a different call. They scrapped the Mad TV insert idea entirely. They thought what they were looking at was strong enough to stand on its own. They ordered a full pilot. MacFarlane was, by some accounts, barely in his mid-20s at this point. He was handed a budget and a network commitment and told to build something. He built something. The pilot he delivered was 15 minutes long, and Fox liked it enough to greenlight a full series. There is a detail worth savoring here, which is that MacFarlane himself has mentioned he thought the pilot would just be used as the Mad TV inserts even while he was making it. He was operating with one set of expectations, and Fox was operating with a completely different set. And somehow the result of that miscommunication was one of the most influential animated series in television history. The show that MacFarlane built was set in a fictional town called Quahog in Rhode Island. It followed the Griffin family, and every member of that family was built around a specific comic concept. Peter Griffin, the father, was a blue-collar working man, overweight, not particularly sharp, employed at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, and later at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He loved beer and television and his friends, and he meant well even when he was causing chaos. Lois Griffin, his wife, was the center of gravity for the household, the one who kept everything from flying apart, a former wealthy socialite who had married down and found genuine happiness in the mess. Their 3 kids each represented a different kind of comedy. Meg, the oldest, was the ordinary one, the teenager who just wanted to fit in and be liked and found herself constantly overlooked in a family full of eccentrics. Chris, the son, was sweet-natured and a little slow, gentle in a way that made his cluelessness endearing. And then there was Stewie, a baby with a cultured British accent, an intellect that dwarfed every adult in his life, and a singular obsession with either taking over the world or killing his mother, Lois, whichever proved more achievable on any given Tuesday. Rounding out the household was Brian, the family dog, who walked on two legs and drank martinis and spoke fluent English, and was genuinely the most grounded, thoughtful person in the house. He was McFarlane's vehicle for dry wit, for the kind of comedy that comes from watching someone intelligent navigate a world full of people who are not. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999. Fox gave it an enormous platform. It aired immediately after Super Bowl 33, which meant that tens of millions of people who had been sitting on their couches watching football were still sitting on those same couches when the first episode of Family Guy began. That first episode, called Death Has a Shadow, pulled in around 22 million viewers. For a brand new show with an unproven creator and a somewhat unusual premise, those numbers were extraordinary. What people saw that night was a show that had its own voice. It was funny in a way that felt genuinely original. The cutaway gags, where a character would reference something and the screen would suddenly cut to a completely unrelated scene playing out the joke, were fresh. The humor ran on multiple registers at once, with something for kids who were probably watching against their parents' wishes, something for teenagers, something for adults who caught the deeper references. McFarlane had built something that operated on several floors simultaneously. Season 1 found its footing quickly. The characters were sharp, the writing was warm underneath its edginess. Peter's obliviousness was funny because it came from a place of genuine good intentions gone sideways. Brian's exasperated intelligence was funny because it felt real, and Stewie's elaborate villainy was funny because no one around him seemed to notice it. The show felt alive. After that strong first season, which averaged about 12.8 million households and ranked number 33 inches the national Nielsen ratings, Family Guy should have been poised for a long, comfortable run. What happened instead was the beginning of a complicated relationship with Fox that would define the show's entire history. But we'll get to all of that. For now, just hold on to the image of a young animator in his mid-20s, having grown up sketching cartoons and selling comics to local newspapers, sitting somewhere and watching his show premiere to 22 million people after the Super Bowl. Whatever came after, that moment happened. Family Guy was born. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's settling in for the night. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it's free, and it genuinely helps. Now let's keep going. Section 2. The Cancellations and the Miraculous Comeback. What happened to Family Guy in the years immediately following its debut is one of the stranger stories in American television history, and not because the show got worse. The show didn't get worse. What happened had almost nothing to do with the quality of the writing or the performances or the characters. What happened was Fox. Specifically, what happened was Fox's scheduling department making a series of decisions that seem almost designed to sabotage their own product. During its second season, Fox moved Family Guy from its comfortable Sunday night slot to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. On the surface, this looks like a vote of confidence. Thursday was a prestigious night for television in those years, the night NBC had built its legendary must-see TV block. But the problem was that at 9 p.m., on Thursday, Family Guy was going head-to-head with Frasier on NBC. Frasier was one of the most decorated and popular sitcoms on television at the time, a critical darling with an enormous loyal audience. Putting a still young animated show up against Frasier was like entering a club soccer team in the World Cup and then being surprised when they lost. The ratings dropped. Fox panicked, or perhaps just pivoted without a clear plan, and moved Family Guy again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it found itself competing against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was at the absolute peak of its cultural dominance in those years. The show was everywhere. People were obsessed with it. It was pulling in enormous numbers every single week and had made Regis Philbin one of the most recognizable faces on American television. Family Guy got beaten there too. Fox kept moving the show around. Different nights, different time slots, with very little warning and very little promotion to let the audience know where to find it. The people who loved Family Guy were trying to watch it and couldn't figure out when it was on. This is a straightforward problem with a straightforward cause. If you keep moving your show around without telling anyone, you will lose viewers. It is not complicated. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. It was a business decision, framed around ratings, but the ratings problem was largely a scheduling problem that Fox itself had created. The show went off the air. The writers scattered. The cast moved on to other things. It seemed like Family Guy was done. And then something unexpected happened. Cartoon Network, which was in the early stages of building its Adult Swim late-night programming block, was looking for content. Adult Swim needed shows that could appeal to the young adult audience that stayed up late and wanted something with an edge. Family Guy, with its back catalog of about 50 episodes across 3 seasons, was available. And because nobody at Fox thought the canceled show had much residual value, Cartoon Network was able to acquire the rights to air reruns for almost nothing. They paid a minimal fee for what turned out to be one of the most valuable pieces of content in cable television at that moment. Family Guy premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April, 2003. What happened next is one of those moments where the numbers are so stark that they tell the story by themselves. The reruns didn't just do well, they dominated. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. It was pulling in viewers that Adult Swim had never seen before. According to reports from that period, the show boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by something in the range of 239%. That figure is almost too large to feel real. 239%. The show that Fox had abandoned was reviving a cable network. At the same time, DVD sets of the first 2 seasons were released, and they sold extraordinarily well. The first DVD collection reportedly moved around 2.8 million copies, a genuinely remarkable number for a canceled animated show from a few years prior. People weren't just watching the reruns. They were spending money on the content. They were buying it and keeping it and showing it to their friends. A fan base that had been scattered by poor scheduling and cancellation was finding the show again, and the word was spreading fast. Fox took notice. The executives who had canceled Family Guy were watching their former property become a phenomenon on another network, watching people buy it on DVD in enormous numbers, and doing the math. In 2004, Fox announced that Family Guy would return for a 4th season. New episodes would be produced. The show was coming back. This was genuinely unprecedented. Shows don't come back from cancellation. Certainly not from double cancellation, because Family Guy had actually been canceled twice over the course of its original run. The first time was after that rough 2nd season when the scheduling wars began, and then it was brought back briefly before Fox pulled the plug again after season 3. 2 cancellations. Most shows don't survive one. Family Guy survived both and was returning with more momentum than it had ever had. The revival was announced at San Diego Comic-Con and was met with enormous enthusiasm. Fans who had been watching reruns on Adult Swim and buying DVDs and talking about the show online felt genuinely vindicated. They had supported something that the network had given up on, and their support had made enough noise to bring it back. For those fans, the 4th season premiere in May 2005 felt like a reward. But there's a shadow over this part of the story that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. When a television show goes away for 3 years and then returns, it does not return as the same show it was when it left. The writer's room that had built those first 3 seasons was gone. The people who had worked on establishing the tone and the characters and the specific rhythms of the humor had moved on to other projects and other shows, because you cannot expect people to wait 3 years for a show that might never come back. When Family Guy returned, it had to be rebuilt from a new foundation by a new team. MacFarlane acknowledged this directly in various interviews over the years. One of the real costs of the cancellations and the scheduling chaos was the constant disruption to the creative staff. New writers had to be found and hired each time the show started again. And new writers, even talented ones, are not the same as the writers who had been there at the beginning. They bring different sensibilities, different reference points, different instincts about what makes the show work. The tone was always going to shift. The 4th season premiere drew strong numbers. People showed up. The hype was real and the audience was there. But if you watch that 4th season with fresh eyes and then go back and watch season 1 or 2 or 3, you can feel the difference. Something had changed. The show was still funny. There were still moments of genuine brilliance scattered throughout. But the heart that had held the original run together, the warmth underneath all the chaos, had started to thin. It would thin further still. The story of Family Guy's revival is ultimately a story with 2 chapters. The first chapter is triumphant. a show that refused to stay dead, that built a loyal audience through reruns and word of mouth and DVD sales, that proved the network wrong and came back stronger than anyone expected. The second chapter is more complicated, about what happens when a show that was built on a specific creative vision has to be rebuilt without that vision fully intact. Both chapters are real. Both chapters matter, and understanding them is the key to understanding everything that came after. Section 3. Seth MacFarlane, the man behind the curtain. There is a version of Seth MacFarlane that most people think they know. The guy who makes the dirty jokes. The guy behind the bumbling dad and the evil baby. The guy who hosted the Oscars that one time and made some people laugh and made other people furious. But the actual Seth MacFarlane, the full picture of the person, is considerably more interesting and considerably more complicated than that surface version, and the details of his life have a way of illuminating things about Family Guy that you might not notice otherwise. Let's start with the morning of the 11th of September 2001. MacFarlane had been in Boston. He had given a speech the previous evening at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, and then had a night out that went, by his own account, a little longer and a little harder than it probably should have given that he had a morning flight. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport, destination Los Angeles. The flight was scheduled to depart at 7:45 a.m. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. The agent told him the flight left at 8:15 a.m. instead of 7:45. So MacFarlane, who was already fighting a hangover, arrived at the airport operating under the assumption that he had time to spare. He didn't. He got to the gate somewhere around 10 minutes after the plane had already pulled away. He was told there was nothing to be done, that he would have to wait for the next available flight, and he went to the airport lounge and fell asleep in a chair. He woke up to the sound of commotion around him. People were gathered around television screens. American Airlines Flight 1 had been hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The plane he had missed by 10 minutes because of a combination of a hangover and a travel agent's error had killed everyone on board. MacFarlane sat there and watched the second plane hit the South Tower while he was still in the airport. He has talked about this in various interviews over the years, with Piers Morgan, with Howard Stern, with other journalists, and what comes through in all of those conversations is a kind of deliberate calm about it. He told Howard Stern that the incident rattled him for a few weeks, but that he doesn't dwell on it. He said he's not much of a fate person, meaning he doesn't find comfort or significance in the idea that he was meant to survive. He has said, in essence, that he was lucky, and that he tries not to read too much into it beyond that. Whether or not you accept that framing, the fact remains that if his travel agent had given him the right departure time, Family Guy as we know it would probably not exist. The show was already in production at that point, 4 years into its original run, but MacFarlane was the center of the whole enterprise. He voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He was the creator and the guiding creative force. Losing him in 2001 would have been losing the show. The strange postscript to this story is that Family Guy would later reference 9, 11 inches several episodes, most notably in the 2011 episode Back to the Pilot, where Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the very first episode of the show, and Brian wrestles with whether to warn people about the attacks. The episode generates its own set of controversies, which we'll get to in a later section. But the idea that the man who made those references was himself supposed to be on one of those planes is a detail that changes how you hear the jokes, or at least how some people hear them. Beyond this near miss, MacFarlane is a genuinely unusual person for someone who became famous primarily for animated gross-out comedy. He is an accomplished singer with a real passion for the great American songbook era of music. He has released multiple albums of jazz and big band standards, worked with full orchestras, performed at Carnegie Hall, and expressed repeatedly that if he had to choose between being remembered as a comedian or a singer, he might choose the music. He did elaborate musical specials for television. He loves that world with a genuine depth that has nothing to do with irony or parody. He is also deeply educated in film history and television history. The references in Family Guy, the ones that go beyond simple pop culture nods, reflect a creator who has done genuine homework. He knows why certain jokes from certain eras of comedy worked. He has a framework for understanding comedy structurally, not just intuitively. And then there is the business side of Seth MacFarlane, which is where the story of Family Guy gets complicated in a different way. Around 2011, MacFarlane began stepping back from the day-to-day creative work on Family Guy. He didn't leave the show. He still showed up to record his characters. He still got the executive producer credit. But the hands-on writing, the story decisions, the creative oversight, those responsibilities shifted to other people. Showrunning duties went to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin. The writer's room continued to function. Episodes continued to be produced, but the specific gravitational pull of MacFarlane's creative presence was no longer as strong as it had been. This happened because MacFarlane was busy. In 2012, he made Ted, a comedy film about a man whose childhood teddy bear magically came to life and stayed alive into adulthood. It earned over $500 million worldwide and made MacFarlane one of the most commercially successful writer-directors working in Hollywood at that moment. He followed it with A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014 and Ted 2 Inches 2015. He created and starred in The Orville, a science fiction series that premiered on Fox in 2017 and later moved to Hulu. He signed a major deal with NBC Universal in 2020, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years. That moved his production company into the Comcast family of networks and away from Fox. That last move matters a great deal. MacFarlane has been openly unhappy with his Fox affiliation for some time. He made a public social media post in 2021 expressing that he wished Family Guy was on any other network, specifically in response to content from Fox News hosts that he found offensive. He described his relationship with Fox as similar to a failing marriage where both parties know it's not working anymore. He is politically liberal and publicly so, and being the flagship animated comedy on a network that shares a corporate heritage with Fox News has been a genuine source of tension for him. So by the time we get to the last decade or so of Family Guy's run, you have a situation where the creator of the show doesn't particularly want it on the network it's airing on, isn't deeply involved in the day-to-day creative work anymore, has multiple other projects that he finds artistically more interesting, and is continuing to voice the characters partly out of contractual obligation and partly, as he said in a 2024 interview, because the show still makes people happy and generates revenue he can direct toward causes, like environmental conservation. He said in that same 2024 interview that the show had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been going for so long that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. He did not speak about new creative directions he was excited to explore. He did not describe burning ideas or characters he wanted to develop. He described the show in terms of its financial utility. That is not a criticism of the man. 25 years into a creative project, that kind of distance is probably necessary for sanity. But it is a window into why Family Guy sounds different in its later seasons than it did in those first 3 years when MacFarlane was the engine of every single decision. In April of 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 more seasons in a significant deal with its parent company Disney, which had absorbed Fox's entertainment properties. The show would continue through season 27 and into the 2028 to 2029 television season, conveniently landing on the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show is not going anywhere. Whether Seth MacFarlane intended to build a 30-year institution or just wanted to see if a cartoon about a bumbling dad and an evil baby could get on television, that is what he built. It is impossible not to find something remarkable about that, even in the midst of all the complications. Section 4. The voice actors and their secrets. The voices of Family Guy are so deeply embedded in the show's identity that it is genuinely difficult to imagine any of these characters sounding any other way. But the stories behind the casting, behind how these particular people ended up in these particular roles, are full of surprises and near misses and strange coincidences that make the whole history feel almost accidental. Like the show itself might have sounded completely different if a few conversations had gone differently. Start with the central fact that Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's principal characters: Peter Griffin, the main character; Brian Griffin, the dog; Stewie Griffin, the baby; Glenn Quagmire, the neighbor. MacFarlane did not set out to voice all of these characters himself as some kind of power move. He voices all of them because he is genuinely talented at it. He has a vocal range that most actors don't possess, and the different voices he creates for these characters are genuinely distinct from one another in ways that go beyond simple pitch adjustment. Peter Griffin's voice was partially inspired by a security guard that MacFarlane encountered during his time in Rhode Island. He has described it in interviews as based on a specific accent and delivery he heard from this person. Stewie Griffin's voice, that crisp, theatrical British accent, was inspired by Rex Harrison, the actor best known for playing Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. The pomposity, the precision, the slightly theatrical air of someone who takes themselves very seriously, all of that came from Harrison's vocal style. MacFarlane has been quite open about this influence. Quagmire was based on a combination of old 1950s-era lounge lizard caricatures, the kind of fast-talking charmer you'd see in old movies or hear on vintage radio programs. Brian was the most personal voice. MacFarlane has said in various contexts that Brian comes closest to his own natural speaking voice. The dry wit, the slight weariness, the sardonic observations about the world, there is a version of the argument that says Brian Griffin is the character MacFarlane uses to say what he would actually say if he were in these situations. Whether or not that's true, Brian always felt like the most inhabited of MacFarlane's performances, the one where something genuine was sitting underneath the character. Now, here is a fact that genuinely astonishes a surprising number of people when they first hear it. William H. Macy auditioned for the role of Brian Griffin. William H. Macy, the Oscar-nominated actor, the man from Fargo and Boogie Nights and The Cooler, came in and read for the role of the talking dog in the Griffin family. MacFarlane has mentioned this in interviews, adding that he thinks he made a bad call, which is a remarkable admission, given that Brian, as voiced by MacFarlane, is one of the most beloved characters in the show's entire run. What a version of Family Guy with William H. Macy as Brian would have sounded like is genuinely hard to picture. It would have been a fundamentally different show. The casting of Lois Griffin came through Alex Borstein, whose voice for the character grew out of a role she was already playing in a Los Angeles stage production. She was performing as a redheaded mother whose vocal patterns she had developed based on a relative, and when she brought that voice to the Family Guy audition, it resonated immediately. MacFarlane, upon hearing it, reportedly gave her direction to make it slightly less drawn out and slightly faster, because at its original tempo, the voice would have made every episode run significantly longer. The direction was delivered bluntly, as per several accounts, with MacFarlane telling her roughly that it needed to be less irritating and quicker, or every episode would be 4 hours long. Borstein adjusted, and Lois found her voice. Seth Green was cast as Chris Griffin after reportedly being dared by a friend to try his Buffalo Bill impression, the character from The Silence of the Lambs, during the audition process. The Buffalo Bill inspiration became the foundation for Chris's voice, that slightly soft, good-natured, somewhat vacant vocal quality. There is a long-running in-joke in the show about this, and the show itself acknowledges it in an episode where Meg reveals a video of Chris performing the Buffalo Bill dance from that film, which is a layered joke for anyone who knows the casting story. Meg Griffin had a different original voice actor. Lacey Chabert, who had been a prominent child actress known for her role on Party of Five, voiced Meg in the first season. Chabert left the role after that first season, reportedly due to schedule conflicts, and was replaced starting from season 2 by Mila Kunis. Kunis was 15 years old when she first auditioned for the role, and there is a story attached to that audition that involves her claiming to the casting team that she was 18 because she didn't want to be turned away for being too young. She got the part. She has voiced Meg ever since, for the entirety of the show's history across more than 25 years. Mila Kunis talking about Meg's treatment in the later seasons is one of the more striking things to come out of interviews with the show's cast. Kunis has spoken publicly about experiencing the effects of the character's abuse storylines in real life, specifically about people coming up to her and using the dismissive catchphrase directed at Meg from the show's middle seasons. That the fictional cruelty translated into something that the real woman behind the character actually experienced is an uncomfortable detail that tends to stick with people once they hear it. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, brings his background in physical comedy and voice acting to a character who exists in a wheelchair but carries himself with the energy of someone who was once the toughest person in any room. Warburton's voice is one of the most recognizable in American television, low and authoritative and capable of enormous comic range. He has been with the show since its very first season, The principal cast received a significant and widely reported pay increase in 2013. Borstein, Kunis, Seth Green, and Mike Henry, who voices Cleveland Brown and several other recurring characters, had their per-episode fees raised to somewhere between $175,000 and $225,000 per episode each. For an animated show where the voice actors are recording their lines separately rather than performing on a physical set together, those are substantial figures. The raise reflected both the cast's importance to the show's identity and their leverage at a moment when Family Guy was still pulling in strong enough numbers to make renegotiation worthwhile. Mike Henry, who had voiced Cleveland Brown since the show's earliest episodes and later starred in The Cleveland Show, the spin-off series, announced in 2020 that he would be stepping away from the role. His statement explained that he felt a black character should be voiced by a black actor. It was a decision that came in the context of a broader industry conversation about voice acting and representation. The role of Cleveland was subsequently recast with Arif Zahir, a voice actor known for impressions, who had actually built a following online partially through his imitations of Cleveland Brown. The handover was handled publicly and relatively smoothly, though it did mark the most significant casting change in the show's history. There are smaller casting facts scattered throughout the show's history that reveal how densely inhabited the Family Guy world is. Adam West, the original television Batman from the 1960s series, played a fictionalized, self-deprecating version of himself as the mayor of the show's fictional town for many years. And he embraced the role with obvious affection right up until his death in 2017. The show honored him after his passing in a way that was genuinely emotional, an acknowledgement of how much he had meant to the Family Guy universe. The table read process, where cast members gather to read through a script before production begins, is something that the show's producers have described as unusually important to the final product. Outsiders are brought in to sit in on these readings specifically to give an objective reaction, to see whether jokes that seem funny in the writer's room actually land when performed out loud for people who didn't help write them. It's a quality control mechanism, a way of testing material against people who don't have any emotional investment in it. The result of all of this, the careful casting, the long-running relationships between actors and characters, the vocal performances refined over decades, is a show whose voices have become almost architectural. You don't just watch Family Guy, you hear it. The voices are as much a part of the experience as the animation or the writing, and the fact that so many of the original cast have remained connected to it for so long gives the show a continuity that its behind-the-scenes upheavals might have otherwise disrupted. Section 5. The Banned and Pulled Episodes. Every television show has moments it would rather forget. A joke that didn't land the way it was intended. An episode that resonated with real events in ways nobody could have predicted. A creative decision that looked fine in the writer's room and looks very different in retrospect. Family Guy has more of these moments than almost any other show in television history, and several of them resulted in episodes being pulled from broadcast entirely, banned from certain countries, or scrubbed from streaming platforms. Let's walk through the major ones. The most definitively banned episode in Family Guy history is a Season 8 installment called Partial Terms of Endearment. This one has the distinction of being the only episode that has never been broadcast in the United States on its original network. The episode centers on Lois agreeing to become a surrogate mother for an infertile couple who are close friends of hers. The arrangement progresses, and then the biological parents are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois in the position of carrying a baby whose intended parents are now dead. The episode's plot then follows Peter and Lois debating what to do, with the abortion question sitting at the center of the whole thing. Fox decided well before the season even aired that this episode would not be broadcast. The announcement was made at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, and it attracted immediate attention. Fox's concern was the subject matter itself, specifically the show's willingness to treat abortion as something that could be explored with a combination of irreverence and genuine emotional weight. The network felt that there was no way to air an episode on that topic without generating a reaction that could damage relationships with advertisers or draw regulatory attention. The episode was released on the Season 8 DVD box set and was broadcast in several other countries, most notably the United Kingdom, where the BBC aired it during a prime time slot, and it reached approximately 1 million households with generally positive reception. It remained unavailable for streaming in the United States for over a decade. It eventually reappeared on Hulu in September of 2022, which was the first time American audiences could watch it through official channels rather than hunting it down on disc. The thing worth knowing about Partial Terms of Endearment is that by most accounts from people who've actually watched it, it's a genuinely well-constructed episode. It treats its subject with the kind of layered, uncomfortable honesty that Family Guy at its best was capable of. The reason it was banned was not because it was poorly made or gratuitously offensive. It was banned because it touched one of the deepest fault lines in American cultural and political life, and did so without resolving neatly on either side. Before Partial Terms of Endearment, there was a Season 3 episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. This one was originally intended to air in 2000, but was held back by Fox for 3 years, over concerns that it might be perceived as anti-Semitic. The episode involves Peter developing an obsession with the idea that Jewish people are inherently better at managing money and business, and he tries to find a Jewish friend to help him with his finances. It's a genuinely complicated episode, the kind that leans into a stereotype with the intention of exposing how absurd that stereotype is, while simultaneously giving you enough rope to argue it either way. Fox sat on it until 2003. The episode eventually aired and attracted some criticism, but also some defenders who felt it was actually doing something more pointed than a simple punchline. A lawsuit connected to this episode is worth noting. The Bourne Company, which holds the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic Disney tune, sued the makers of Family Guy over a parody song called I Need a Jew that used the same melody with new lyrics. The lawsuit claimed that the parody damaged the value and reputation of the original song. In March of 2009, a federal judge ruled that Family Guy had not infringed copyright, finding that the transformation of the song for comedic purposes was protected. The case was interesting partly because it tested the legal limits of parody, an area where entertainment and copyright law intersect in genuinely complex ways. Then came the Boston Marathon episode. Turban Cowboy aired on the 17th of March 2013. It was the 15th episode of Season 11. In it, Peter befriends a man named Mahmoud, who turns out to be a terrorist, and the episode includes a cutaway gag showing Peter winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the crowd of runners. It's the kind of dark, violent cutaway that Family Guy had been deploying for years by that point, shocking in the moment but surrounded by enough cartoon absurdity that it generally landed as comedy rather than something genuinely disturbing. The Boston Marathon bombing happened on the 15th of April 2013, less than 4 weeks after Turban Cowboy aired. The attack killed 3 people and injured hundreds more, and in its immediate aftermath, someone on the internet took 2 separate scenes from Turban Cowboy, the Boston Marathon cutaway, and a separate scene about a bombing, and edited them together to suggest that the episode had somehow predicted or depicted the actual attack. The edited clip spread rapidly. It was misleading in the most literal sense, taking 2 completely unrelated scenes from different parts of the episode and splicing them to look like a connected sequence. But in the raw emotional hours and days after the bombing, the nuance of "this is deceptively edited" got lost in the speed of how fast the clip was circulating. McFarlane's response on social media was immediate and direct. He called the edited clip abhorrent. He expressed sympathy for the victims. He made clear that the original episode had nothing to do with the real attack and that the clip circulating was a deliberate misrepresentation. Fox pulled the episode from Fox.com, from Hulu, and from Amazon. The network stated that it had no immediate plans to rebroadcast it. Conservative commentators, including Alex Jones, who was already deeply embedded in conspiracy culture by that point, tried to suggest connections between the episode and the real attack. The suggestion was not serious from an evidentiary standpoint, but it amplified the controversy significantly. The episode did eventually return to cable reruns and was included on DVD releases. It reappeared on Hulu in September of 2022, the same month as Partial Terms of Endearment. It remains unavailable on most U.S. streaming platforms today. The episode about domestic violence also drew serious attention. Season 10's Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, dealt with domestic abuse in a way that many critics found deeply troubling. The episode follows a character named Brenda who is in a relationship with a physically abusive boyfriend named Jeff. The resolution of the episode involves Joe and Quagmire deciding that the best solution is to kill Jeff, which they do. The episode was criticized for presenting murder as the correct response to domestic violence, for depicting Brenda as complicit in her own abuse in ways that felt like victim blaming, and for treating serious subject matter with a tone that veered into something genuinely unpleasant rather than darkly funny. A.J. Hammer of Showbiz Tonight described watching the episode as a depressing experience, the kind of response that suggests the show had managed to be shocking without being entertaining, which is the worst possible outcome for that kind of material. Critics from feminist publications were particularly sharp in their assessments. The episode is not technically banned or pulled, but it is consistently cited as one of the most troubling creative decisions in the show's history. There was the period after the 9/11 attacks when the show briefly pulled an episode that had already aired, retroactively deciding certain material was inappropriate given the national mood. And there are individual jokes across various episodes that have been trimmed or removed in different regional broadcasts, reflecting how specific the threshold for acceptable content is, depending on where you are in the world. Venezuela banned Family Guy from its cable networks entirely in response to a 2009 episode called 420, in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's town. Venezuela's justice minister at the time cited it as an example of American media promoting drug use, and cable stations were warned they would face fines for continuing to air the show. The sum of all these bans and pulls and controversies paints a picture of a show that has spent more than 25 years operating right on the edge of what broadcast television will tolerate, and occasionally stepping over that edge and discovering where the line actually is by finding itself on the wrong side of it. Section 6. The groups who fought back. If Family Guy has one enemy that has pursued it with the greatest consistency and the longest duration, that enemy is the Parents Television Council, and the story of their relationship with the show is almost as long and nearly as complicated as the show itself. The Parents Television Council is a conservative nonprofit organization whose stated mission is to advocate for content on television that is suitable for families. They monitor programming, publish reports, contact advertisers, file complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, and generally make it their business to keep track of what is airing on broadcast television and whether it meets their standards. Their standards and Family Guy's standards are not compatible, and both sides have known this from the beginning. The PTC targeted Family Guy almost from its premiere. In May of 2000, they launched a campaign aimed at Fox to persuade the network to cancel the show entirely. This followed the show's return from its first scheduling hiatus in the second season. The PTC claimed that the show had generated strong advertiser resistance, and that its content was inappropriate for the time slot it occupied in early prime time. They were particularly concerned about the show's animation style, specifically the fact that it looks like a cartoon, which means children who flip through channels might stop and watch without any indication from the visual format that the content is intended for adults. Family Guy made the PTC's list of worst primetime shows for family viewing in 2000, in 2005, and again in 2006. In addition, more than 40 individual Family Guy episodes were designated Worst TV Show of the Week by the organization at various points across the show's run. They also named it the worst show of the entire 2006 to 2007 season. For context, that year included a lot of television. There were many candidates. Family Guy won. The PTC did not just publish critical reports. They filed formal complaints with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which has the authority to fine broadcast networks for indecency violations. The first FCC indecency complaint related to Family Guy followed a January 2005 rebroadcast of an episode called "And the Wiener Is." The FCC reviewed the complaint and dismissed it, finding that the episode did not meet the legal standard for indecency given the absence of explicit depictions or material intended to pander. This set a pattern that would repeat itself. The PTC would file. The FCC would review. The standard for indecency on broadcast television is specific and narrow enough that most Family Guy content, however objectionable to the PTC, didn't technically qualify. Subsequent complaints followed over the years. The episode PTV from 2005, which was itself a satirical commentary on the FCC, generated a PTC campaign for its members to file complaints specifically about the episode's sexually explicit humor. There were complaints about Family Guy, about Business Guy, about Brian and Stewie, about A Fistful of Meg, about Quagmire's mom. The complaints addressed everything from lap dance scenes to jokes about statutory rape to excretory references to sexually explicit dialogue. None of them, as far as public record reflects, resulted in successful FCC enforcement actions against the show. The PTC also went after the show's advertisers, which was a more practically effective strategy than regulatory complaints. They wrote letters to companies like the Wrigley Company and Burger King, pointing out that their advertising dollars were supporting content that the PTC felt was inappropriate for families, and that the company's own products were marketed to children who might be watching. Getting an advertiser to pull out of a show is a more direct form of pressure than waiting for a regulatory body to act, and it creates real economic consequences. MacFarlane's response to the PTC's ongoing campaign was generally the same as his response to most criticism of the show: that Family Guy is an equal opportunity offender that targets every group and every sacred cow with the same willingness, and that this consistency is its own kind of fairness. He has said that the writers try to find a defensible intellectual point in every joke, something that could be articulated as the reason for the joke beyond just, "this is offensive." Whether that defense holds up depends heavily on which specific jokes you're examining. The Sarah Palin incident is one of the more memorable moments of the show's conflict with outside groups. In February of 2010, an episode called Extra Large Medium aired, in which a female character with Down syndrome makes a reference to her mother being a former governor of Alaska. Bristol Palin, the daughter of Sarah Palin, who herself has a younger brother with Down syndrome, wrote a public response criticizing the show for what she characterized as mockery of her brother. Sarah Palin herself appeared on The O'Reilly Factor and called the people who made Family Guy cruel, cold-hearted in their treatment of the subject. The response from the show's side was interesting. Andrea Faye Friedman, the actress who voiced the character with Down syndrome in that episode, has Down syndrome herself, and she spoke directly to the criticism. She said the joke was aimed at Sarah Palin's political persona rather than at her son, and she expressed frustration with Palin for using her son as a political touchstone. Friedman's statement gave the show a counter-argument that was hard to dismiss, because here was a person who actually has Down syndrome saying she read the joke as political satire rather than as an attack on people with her condition. MacFarlane characterized Palin's reaction as a presumptuous attempt to speak on behalf of a community without being asked, while Friedman was saying something quite different from what Palin assumed. The episode itself did not return to the subject. The controversy dissipated over time without any resolution that fully satisfied either side. GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, engaged with the show repeatedly over various episodes touching on LGBTQ themes. The 2010 episode Quagmire's Dad, in which Quagmire's father comes out as a transgender woman and undergoes surgery to become Ida, generated significant criticism. The episode was seen by many as transphobic, particularly for a scene where Brian vomits when he discovers he has had a sexual encounter with Ida, and for various other moments that critics felt reinforced harmful stereotypes about transgender people. GLAAD released a statement expressing concern. MacFarlane's public position was that the show had made genuine efforts to include representation and to treat the subject with some care, pointing to moments in the episode where Lois defends Ida and Peter is called out for his transphobic comments. Critics responded that including a moment where a character is called out for being transphobic does not counterbalance a scene that depicts a biological reaction of disgust in response to transgender identity. The conversation around that episode has evolved over the years as public understanding of transgender issues has deepened, and it remains a contested piece of the show's history. The episode Peter Asmund from Season 8 contained a scene in which Stewie's preschool class performs a song about Terri Schiavo, the woman who spent years in a persistent vegetative state at the center of one of the most anguished public debates about end-of-life care in American history. The song included lines characterizing Schiavo as a plant and as the most expensive plant the viewers would ever see. Schiavo's family and various advocacy groups for people with brain injuries responded with public objections, and her brother urged Fox to cancel the show outright. The show continued. Each of these confrontations follows a similar pattern. A group is offended or hurt. They respond publicly. The show defends itself or ignores the criticism. The controversy runs its course. The show continues. And in that pattern, over 25 years, Family Guy has built something that might be described as a kind of armor made from accumulated controversy, each new objection adding another layer to a reputation that was already fully established. Section 7. The South Park War. Of all the conflicts Family Guy has found itself in over the years, the one with South Park is in a category by itself. It is not a conflict between a television show and a government regulator, or a television show and a religious group, or a television show and a political figure. It is a conflict between two animated comedies about the nature of comedy itself, and the terms of that argument have shaped how a lot of people think about both shows. The specific origin point is April 2006, when South Park aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The episode was ostensibly about the controversy surrounding South Park's own willingness to depict the Prophet Muhammad, a creative decision that had generated genuine security threats directed at the show's creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone. The Muhammad storyline gave Parker and Stone a vessel to explore questions about free speech and self-censorship in entertainment, which was genuinely something they cared about deeply. But inside that vessel was a second agenda, and that second agenda was taking a very public shot at Family Guy. In Cartoon Wars, the character of Cartman hatches a plan to get Family Guy canceled by convincing Fox to refuse to air an episode that depicts Muhammad. Cartman doesn't actually care about the religious sensitivities at stake. What he cares about is getting rid of Family Guy because he hates the show. The episode takes him to the Family Guy studio in Hollywood, where he discovers the secret behind how the show's jokes are written. The writers of Family Guy, according to Cartoon Wars, are manatees, not human beings in a room pitching ideas and crafting scripts through careful deliberation. Manatees, large aquatic mammals in a tank, who write the show's cutaway gags by selecting from a pool of beach balls, each with a random word printed on it. The manatees push 5 balls together, and whatever random collection of nouns and verbs results becomes a Family Guy joke. The example given in the episode is laundry, date, winning, Mexico, Gary Coleman. A random assemblage of words, connected by nothing, generating a non sequitur that the show then cuts to without any relationship to the main story. The joke is pointed and it is specific. Parker and Stone were not just saying that Family Guy wasn't their taste. They were making a structural argument that the show's signature comedy device, the cutaway gag, required no creative intelligence to produce because there was no actual connection between the joke and anything else happening in the episode. Any random combination of elements could generate a cutaway. The jokes were interchangeable. The writers weren't making creative decisions so much as rolling dice. Parker and Stone have been explicit about their feelings in various interviews. They said on the commentary track for Cartoon Wars that they don't respect Family Guy's writing. Stone said something to the effect that you can tell smart people work on it, but that he doesn't think they work hard enough. Parker's criticism was more focused on the structural laziness, the reliance on disconnected jokes as a substitute for actual story construction. McFarlane's response was, by his own description, nuanced. In a 2012 Rolling Stone interview, he said he thought the Cartoon Wars episode was funny and accurate about certain tendencies of Family Guy. He acknowledged that the criticism had genuine validity, but he expressed confusion about what he characterized as more personal attacks from Parker and Stone in other press appearances. He said the relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons had become genuinely friendly over time, and he seemed to find the South Park feud more confusing than the criticism itself. Family Guy responded in the show. In a 2009 episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us, there is a scene at an improv comedy show where Peter Griffin gets enormous laughs from the crowd by inserting pre-written, context-free gags into the middle of the performance. The joke is Peter's insistence on scripted material in an environment that should be spontaneous, and it is a clearly coded retaliation to the manatee critique, essentially arguing that there is nothing wrong with prepared material being funnier than improvised material. Writers from The Simpsons and King of the Hill reportedly called Parker and Stone to thank them for making Cartoon Wars. This detail, which Parker and Stone have discussed publicly, suggests that the feeling of being grouped together with Family Guy was a frustration that extended beyond just the South Park camp. There was a broader contingent of people in animated comedy who felt that Family Guy's success had complicated how their work was perceived. The feud has never been formally resolved. Parker and Stone have made additional digs at Family Guy in subsequent South Park episodes. MacFarlane has occasionally responded and occasionally not. The relationship is one of those ongoing cultural tensions that never quite reaches a definitive conclusion because neither side has any particular incentive to definitively end it. What makes the South Park critique so persistent as a conversation point is that it isn't just mean-spirited rivalry. It's a genuine argument about what comedy is supposed to do and how humor is supposed to work. Parker and Stone's position is that jokes should grow organically from story and character, that the funniest moments in a piece of comedy come from the situation itself rather than being grafted onto it from outside. MacFarlane's show operates on the opposite principle, that comedy can exist in self-contained capsules disconnected from any broader narrative, and that this disconnection is itself a kind of creative freedom. Both positions have genuine validity. The problem for Family Guy in this debate is that the later seasons of the show seem to prove Parker and Stone's point more than the early seasons did. When the show was working at its best, in those first 3 seasons, the cutaways were bonuses layered on top of solid stories. When the show was at its most criticized, in the middle seasons, the cutaways had replaced the stories entirely. The manatee joke was funnier and sadder as an observation about the later show than it was about the early one. Section 8. Brian Griffin's death and the biggest stunt in the show's history. On the 24th of November, 2013, the 6th episode of Family Guy's 12th season aired. It was called Life of Brian. At the end of the episode, while Stewie and Brian were playing street hockey outside, a car came around the corner at speed and struck Brian directly. The following scene showed the Griffin family gathered at a veterinary clinic. Brian died on the table, in pain, surrounded by the people who loved him. The family held a funeral. Brian Griffin was buried. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico from The Sopranos, was introduced as the Griffin family's replacement pet within the same episode. What happened next, in the days and weeks following that episode, was unlike almost anything that had ever happened in the history of animated television. The internet went into something close to genuine mourning. Fan communities flooded social platforms with responses that ranged from heartbroken to furious. A Change.org petition demanding Brian's return gathered tens of thousands of signatures almost overnight. The petition addressed itself to Seth MacFarlane and Fox and grew rapidly enough that it became national news. Family Guy had been on television for 14 years at that point, and Brian Griffin's death generated more sustained public response than almost any episode the show had ever aired. People were upset in a way that felt real. Brian Griffin had been a constant presence in their lives, in many cases for most of their adult lives. He was the character many viewers most identified with. He was the voice of reason, the dry wit, the one who looked at the chaos around him and reacted the way a thoughtful person would react. Losing him felt like losing a friend. Fox and the show's producers kept up the pretense. Vinny was added to the opening credits. Promotional material for upcoming episodes featured the new dog. MacFarlane and the show's executive producer Steve Callahan gave interviews saying they wanted to shake things up, that the show needed to demonstrate it was still capable of genuine surprises, that the death was meant to be taken seriously. Callahan called it a fun way to shake things up. The death lasted 3 weeks. On the 15th of December 2013, just 3 episodes after Brian's death, the episode Christmas Guy aired. In it, Stewie manages to acquire a time travel device and uses it to go back in time and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back to life. The plot reset. The Griffin family had their dog back, Vinny disappeared without much explanation, and everything returned to the status quo as though none of it had happened. The fan reaction to Brian's return was not simply relief. A significant portion of the audience was genuinely angry, not because Brian came back, but because of what his return revealed about why he had been killed in the first place. If the death was supposed to be meaningful, if the show was really prepared to change its status quo permanently and explore what that loss meant for the characters, you would not bring the character back 3 weeks later. The speed of the resurrection told people exactly what the death had been. It had been a stunt, a calculated move to generate attention and viewership at a moment when the show's season 12 premiere had opened down 21% from the previous year. MacFarlane eventually confirmed this framing, at least partially. At a Television Critics Association press tour in January of 2014, he said that the producers had been surprised by the intensity of the fan reaction, that they hadn't expected the level of genuine emotion people expressed. He said Brian's death did what it was designed to do, which was to remind people that the show was still capable of genuine surprises. He added that they would not do it again because they had already done it. The admission that it had been designed to generate a specific response, that the calculation had worked, satisfied nobody. People were not angry because the stunt hadn't worked. They were angry because it had worked by exploiting their emotional attachment to a character in a way that turned out to have no real creative commitment behind it. You can manipulate an audience into feeling grief. You cannot manipulate them into respecting the manipulation. The Life of Brian episode has a 4.7 rating out of 10 on IMDb, making it one of the lowest-rated episodes of the show's entire run by audience scoring. It is consistently listed in conversations about the worst Family Guy episodes ever produced. There is genuine critical disagreement because the AV Club actually gave it an A-, the highest grade they gave any episode of the season, praising the emotional sincerity of Brian's death scene and the family's grief. But among the fan base, the verdict was largely settled early and hasn't changed much since. What happened to Brian's character after his return is its own separate study. MacFarlane said at that same press tour that he hoped the experience might make the writing staff treat Brian's character with more care going forward, since the audience response had made clear how much people still genuinely cared. There is little evidence that this happened in any sustained way, Brian continued, in the seasons following his resurrection, to be written in ways that many longtime viewers found difficult to reconcile with the character they had originally loved. The Brian death stunt is now a case study in television manipulation. It demonstrates that you can manufacture attention through shocking content, that the audience's emotional investment in fictional characters is real enough to be exploited for ratings. It also demonstrates that audiences know when they've been used, and that the cost of that recognition is a kind of erosion of trust that is very hard to repair. Section 9. The dark jokes that aged terribly and the ones that landed too accurately. Comedy operates in time. A joke made in 2005 about a public figure exists in a specific cultural context, and when that context changes, the joke changes with it. Sometimes the change makes the joke funnier in retrospect, like discovering an old satire that turns out to have been even more accurate than the writer knew. Sometimes the change makes the joke land in a completely different way than it was intended, producing discomfort instead of laughter. Family Guy has accumulated an unusually large collection of both categories. The Kevin Spacey example is the one that tends to come up most often in discussions of jokes that accidentally became something else. In 2005, in the episode Jungle Love, there is a moment where Stewie runs through a department store yelling that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. In 2005, this landed as a random, somewhat absurdist non sequitur. Kevin Spacey was a two-time Oscar winner at that point, one of the most respected actors working in American film. There was no public basis for the joke beyond whatever vague Hollywood innuendo might have been circulating. In 2017, Anthony Rapp told BuzzFeed News that Kevin Spacey had made unwanted sexual advances toward him when Rapp was a teenager in 1986. The story opened a cascade of further allegations, and Spacey's career essentially ended within weeks of those revelations becoming public. Looking back at the Family Guy joke from 2005, the Spacey's basement line took on an entirely different character. It was no longer a random joke. It sounded, retroactively, like someone had known something. MacFarlane has stated repeatedly that the writers knew nothing specific about Spacey when the joke was written. The line was written as a random cutaway, part of the manatee ball style of humor where unusual combinations of words generate jokes without any specific factual grounding. He has said that the rumor about Spacey that existed in 2005, which had to do with an incident at a dog park rather than the pattern of behavior that emerged later, was explained to him only after the joke was already written. The network cleared it for broadcast because the specific incident it referenced was low-level enough not to constitute a serious allegation. Whether that explanation is fully satisfying depends on how comfortable you are with the idea that completely random jokes can still cause harm when they land on real situations. The Family Guy team didn't know. The joke was still made. The person it referenced really had done the things the joke implied. These facts coexist in a messy way. The show's track record of predicting or accidentally reflecting real events extends beyond this single example. Various people have cataloged Family Guy moments that appear to foreshadow events in ways that are easy to explain as coincidence and hard to fully dismiss. The structure of cutaway gag humor, where you generate unexpected juxtapositions by putting random elements together, means that over 25 years and hundreds of episodes, some of those juxtapositions are going to line up uncomfortably with things that actually happen. Given enough material, statistical probability ensures that some jokes will land too close to reality. The Conway-Twitty running gag is a different kind of dark joke. Dark not because of what it references, but because of what it says about the show's relationship with its own audience. Conway-Twitty was a country music singer who died in 1993. Starting in the show's middle seasons, Family Guy began a recurring bit where, instead of an actual cutaway joke, the show would simply cut to a full, unedited performance of a Conway-Twitty song. Not a brief clip, not a reference. A complete performance, running for several minutes, with nothing else happening on screen. The joke, if it could be called that, was the absence of a joke. The expectation of comedy being replaced by the reality of a country song with no punchline. The first time this happened, many viewers found it genuinely funny in a surreal way. The commitment to not being funny, the straight-faced delivery of musical content where comedy was expected, had a certain provocateur energy. By the third or fourth time it happened across different episodes, the energy had changed. It felt less like a calculated choice, and more like the show wasn't sure what else to do with the runtime. The shock value trajectory of the show is documented in detail elsewhere in this script, but it connects to this section in a specific way. Family Guy's early dark humor landed because the darkness served the joke. The joke about AIDS patients in one of the show's earliest controversial moments, where Peter and a barbershop quartet sing and dance around a dying man, generated genuine outrage but also had a certain black comedy consistency to it. The offense was deliberate and specific, and connected to a satirical point. Later dark humor in the show sometimes seemed to exist purely for its own sake, shock deployed because the writers were out of ideas for how else to generate a reaction. There is also the question of jokes that aged poorly simply due to shifting cultural standards, rather than specific real-world events. The show's treatment of transgender characters in various episodes looks significantly different now than it did when those episodes aired. Not because the facts changed, but because public understanding of transgender identity has deepened considerably. Jokes about disability that circulated unchallenged in the 2000s now sit differently. Content involving the objectification or casual cruelty toward female characters that was once unremarkable by the standards of adult animated comedy is now more clearly visible as a pattern worth examining. This is not unique to Family Guy. Almost every piece of comedy from that era has moments that require contextual navigation to watch now. But Family Guy has more of those moments than most, partly because its particular brand of shock humor pushed harder into those territories than most shows did, and partly because it ran for so long that the accumulation is larger. The genuinely eerie accuracy of some jokes, the Spacey joke being the most cited, the occasional piece of satire that turned out to predict something real, has given the show a strange reputation in certain corners of internet culture as something that knows things. This is obviously not literally true, but it is a testament to what happens when you generate enough random content over enough time. Some of it is going to land in places you never intended. 10. The hidden Easter eggs and in jokes you never caught. Underneath all the controversy and the cultural arguments and the ratings discussions, there is a quieter, more playful aspect of Family Guy that rewards careful attention. The show has, from its earliest episodes, embedded layers of detail that most viewers will never notice but that reveal a great deal about the people who made it. Some of these are references to other films and television shows. Some are inside jokes from the production itself. Some are deliberate tests of how closely the audience is paying attention. Start with the most immediately visible category, which is the show's layered references to its own history and origins. In the second season episode If I'm Dying, I'm Lying, Peter wins a contest that allows him to choose any canceled television show to have brought back. He picks a show called Gumball 2 Gumball, a fictional program about Bryant Gumball and Greg Gumball going on adventures together. This is an inside joke that most viewers wouldn't catch. Gumball 2 Gumball was the actual name of the very first project that Seth MacFarlane pitched to Fox before Family Guy. The callback to his own pre-Family Guy history, buried in a throwaway detail, is the kind of thing that rewards people who know the production history. In the episode Model Misbehavior, there is a sequence where the Griffin family wins a boat race and their story appears in newspapers. If you pause the scene and read the newspaper headlines, a secondary headline below the main story reads, "DVDs paused for headline joke millions disappointed." This is the show acknowledging and trolling its own audience of eagle-eyed viewers who pause their DVD players to read background text. The joke is that you will find a joke if you look for one, and the joke is that there is no joke. In a Season 1 episode, Stewie is seen playing with alphabet blocks in the background of a scene. If you pay attention to how the blocks are arranged, they spell out Redrum. This is the famous message from The Shining, the Stephen King novel, and Stanley Kubrick film, which is murder spelled backward and is associated in the story with a child's precognitive awareness of violent events. Stewie is a murderous genius with a British accent who wants to kill his mother. Of course his alphabet blocks spell Redrum. Of course. The voice cast has left its own marks scattered throughout. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, auditioned for the role using a Buffalo Bill impression from The Silence of the Lambs on a dare from a friend. The show later incorporated this into an episode where Meg reveals a video of Chris performing Buffalo Bill's famous dance scene from the film as a way to embarrass him. The joke works on two levels: the obvious surface level where Meg is doing something cruel to her brother, and the deeper level where it's a reference to how the actor who voices Chris actually got the role in the first place. There are background visual gags hidden throughout many episodes that only become visible when you watch on a screen with sufficient resolution and with the pause button close at hand. In Road to Rupert, which was an early Brian and Stewie adventure episode, there is a moment where you can spot the DVD cover for Stewie Griffin, the untold story, sitting in the background of a shot. The DVD is visible on Brian's table during a yard sale, and the extended DVD version of that same scene contains an additional joke where Stewie references the real DVD's existence, creating a recursive in-joke where the show acknowledges a product based on the show within an episode of the show. The Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8, which is widely regarded as one of the finest episodes Family Guy ever produced, contains layers of continuity references that reward careful viewers. In this episode, which places the two characters alone in a bank vault for the entire runtime, without any cutaway gags or external plot, Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has considered ending his own life. This detail is handled with unusual seriousness for Family Guy. What many viewers miss is that throughout the episode, there are small contradictions with established canon from earlier seasons. Things Brian says about Stewie's abilities or earlier events that don't quite line up with previous episodes. Whether these contradictions are accidental continuity errors or deliberate choices is genuinely unclear, but the episode's overall weight comes from how completely it abandons the show's usual format to do something raw and direct. The show has also hidden references to real events in its production history. In the revival seasons following the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, there is an in-joke in an episode that MacFarlane himself described as a direct middle finger to a specific actor who had worked against the strike. MacFarlane has mentioned that the actor called after the episode aired and spent about an hour on the phone angry about it. The specific episode and the actor are not something MacFarlane has named publicly in most interviews, but the existence of the joke as a production insider reference is documented. The connection between Chris Griffin's voice and Buffalo Bill is not the only Silence of the Lambs reference embedded in the show. The series has returned to that specific film multiple times in various ways, suggesting a genuine affection for it among the writing staff that goes beyond simple pop culture citation. The show also has a running relationship with its own fictional mythology that rewards long-term viewers. The giant chicken, Ernie, who has been in pitched battle with Peter in several extended and increasingly elaborate fight sequences, is officially confirmed dead as of Season 23. But his death was not a cutaway or an offhand reference. He was given a genuine send-off, which is remarkable given that he is a giant chicken who has been in exactly the kind of escalating, consequence-free cartoon battles that the show usually deploys as pure absurdist spectacle. The fact that his death was treated as meaningful in some sense, that it was a real ending rather than a reset, makes it one of the stranger pieces of genuine continuity in the show's later run. There are fan communities dedicated specifically to cataloging the background details, the Easter eggs, the hidden references, and the continuity threads that run through Family Guy's hundreds of episodes. The show rewards this kind of attention in a way that contradicts the South Park critique to some degree. If there were truly no thought behind the construction of individual episodes, if it were genuinely random in the way the manatee joke suggests, these layers would not exist. They are the product of writers who are paying attention, who have opinions about film history and television history and their own show's mythology, and who find ways to embed those opinions in the work in places where only the most devoted viewers will find them. Section 11. The characters who changed forever. There is a specific word that gets used in fan communities when talking about long-running television shows, particularly animated ones. The word is Flanderization, and it comes from Ned Flanders on The Simpsons. Early Ned Flanders was a multidimensional character, a kind man who happened to be deeply religious, who had a full emotional life and relationships and personal struggles. As The Simpsons continued over decades, Ned Flanders was gradually reduced until his entire personality became his religiosity. The complexity drained away, and only the dominant trait remained. That process of reduction is Flanderization. Family Guy may be the most extreme example of Flanderization in the history of animated television, and it happened to almost every major character in the show's cast over the course of its run. Peter Griffin's transformation is the one that gets discussed most often, and it is the most dramatic. In the first 3 seasons, Peter was genuinely lovable. He was dumb in the way that feels grounded, the kind of dumb that comes from not thinking things through rather than from an inability to function as a human being. He loved his family. He loved Lois with a real warmth that came through in the writing. When he messed up, which was constantly, the loop closed. He realized what he had done and he tried to fix it. He apologized. He hugged his wife. The cycle of mistake and recovery gave the character genuine humanity. Starting around season 4 and accelerating through season 8 and beyond, Peter's stupidity went somewhere new. It went from lovable fool to something closer to a person incapable of basic human reasoning or empathy. He began doing things that were not just foolish but genuinely cruel, pushing Lois into the water when he thought there was a shark, stealing Stewie's Halloween candy, actively working to sabotage the marriages and friendships of the people around him. The warmth that had defined him drained away, and what remained was someone difficult to root for. The moment that perhaps best captures how far the character had traveled comes in the season 10 episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, when Meg delivers a devastating speech to her family about how they have treated her. She turns to Peter and calls him completely selfish, completely irresponsible, without education or genuine interests, simply doing whatever reckless thing he wants without caring about its effect on others. She lists specific things he has done to her. She tells him that if anyone from the outside world could see how he treats her, he would be in jail. Peter's response is to laugh. The early Peter would have been stung by those words. He might not have fully grasped them because he was never the most self-aware person in any room, but he would have felt something. The later Peter feels nothing. He finds it funny. That reaction is the character's arc in miniature. Brian's transformation ran parallel but in a different direction. Brian started as the character who was most like a real, fully developed person. He had genuine intelligence, genuine affection for the people around him, genuine personal failings that felt human. He was unlucky in love. He couldn't finish his novel. He drank too much. He had feelings he kept mostly to himself. These imperfections made him sympathetic because they were recognizable. The later Brian replaced those recognizable imperfections with something harder to sympathize with. He became arrogant in a way that had no warmth behind it. He became hypocritical, preaching about ethics and morality while behaving with less consideration for others than almost anyone around him. The episode Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9 is often cited as a turning point, a moment where Brian achieves something through Stewie's encouragement and then responds by treating Stewie with contempt. He becomes unrecognizable from the loyal, caring friend of the early seasons. The intelligence is still performed, but it no longer feels earned. The Quagmire speech in the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black deserves its own paragraph. In that episode, Quagmire delivers a monologue directly to Brian, laying out exactly why he finds Brian so insufferable. He accuses Brian of being a fraud who pretends to intellect he hasn't earned. He points out Brian's consistent bad behavior toward women. He brings up the failed writing career that Brian talks about as though it were a tragedy, when the evidence is that the writing isn't actually good. He calls Brian out for hitting on Lois repeatedly in front of Peter, his supposed best friend. Every single thing Quagmire says is backed up by on-screen evidence. It is not a character attack, it is a summary of documented events. What makes this moment remarkable is that the show clearly knew Brian had become a problem. The writers understood that the audience was frustrated with the character. The Quagmire speech was their way of acknowledging it, of putting the criticism in someone's mouth and having it delivered directly on screen. The problem is that the speech did not lead to change. Brian did not improve after this moment. If anything, the episodes that followed found him behaving worse. Having a character acknowledge a problem and then continuing to have that same problem is not character development. It is just adding a layer of self-awareness to the same pattern. Stewie's transformation is its own genre of loss. The early Stewie was genuinely original, the kind of character that comes along rarely in any medium. An infant with a cultured British accent who built advanced weapons in his crib, plotted world domination, and spent his considerable intelligence on trying to kill his mother, while the adults around him heard nothing but babbling. The humor was the gap between what the audience could hear him saying and what every other character perceived. It was layered and specific and unlike anything else on television. The writers made a deliberate decision, documented in MacFarlane's own comments across various interviews, to move Stewie away from the evil genius concept starting around Season 4. The reasoning was that they felt they had explored every possible angle of the character's villainy, and that continuing in that direction would make the show feel stale. They transitioned Stewie toward a softer emotional register, leaning into his friendship with Brian, developing storylines about his personal identity and insecurities. The Road to Adventure episodes became the primary vehicle for his character. The friendship between Stewie and Brian is genuinely good. The road trip episodes are among the best things Family Guy ever made. But the trade was losing something irreplaceable. The evil genius baby was not a concept that had been fully exhausted. It was a concept that had been abandoned because it was challenging to keep fresh, which is a very different thing. The show has now produced more seasons with the softer, Brian-friendly Stewie than it ever made with the villainous original version. The argument that the original concept had run its course is hard to sustain when the replacement version has run for over 15 seasons. Meg's arc is perhaps the most uncomfortable to trace from beginning to end. In Season 1, Meg Griffin was a relatable teenager, the normal one in an abnormal household, whose main characteristic was being overlooked by a family that was simply more colorful than she was. Her difficulty fitting in at school, her desire to be noticed, her occasional loneliness, these were genuine and sympathetic character notes. What the show built on top of those notes, over roughly 10 seasons from around Season 4 through Season 14, was something that went from dark comedy to something genuinely hard to sit with. The jokes stopped being about Meg being overlooked and became about Meg deserving to be hurt. Peter's behavior toward her escalated from inattentive fathering to something that the show's own characters, when they stopped to articulate it, acknowledged was abuse. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode, where Meg finally confronts her family and then agrees to go back to being their target because the family can't function without someone to project onto, has a thesis that many viewers found troubling. The show is telling you that some people just have to absorb abuse for the good of others around them, and that this is a noble sacrifice rather than a tragedy. There has been genuine improvement in recent seasons. Starting around Season 14 and more consistently from Season 15 onward, the extreme abuse of Meg decreased. She began to be written as competent, resilient, occasionally formidable. The addition of more women to the writing staff over those years has been credited by various people connected to the show as a contributing factor to this change. By Season 22, the dynamic had shifted enough that Meg was receiving storylines where she was the subject rather than the object, where things happened because of her rather than simply to her. But 10 seasons is a long time to reduce a character to a punching bag. The restoration of Meg's dignity in the show's later years is real, but it sits on top of a decade of content that defined her differently. Section 12. Family Guy Today, Where It Stands and What It All Means. In April of 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had secured a massive renewal deal with Disney, which now owns Fox's entertainment properties through its acquisition of 21st Century Fox. The deal locked the show in for 4 additional seasons, running through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season. That would bring Family Guy to its 30th anniversary still in production. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. Let that number sink in for a moment. 30 years. A show that was created by a graduate student in his mid-20s as a pilot for what he thought might be inserts on a sketch comedy show. A show that was canceled twice in its first 3 seasons. A show that came back from the dead through Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales when nobody with institutional power believed in it anymore. Still going, locked in through 2029. The show that exists now is watched by a fraction of the audience it had at its peak. Season 4, when Family Guy returned from cancellation in 2005, averaged around 7.9 million viewers. That was already down from the 22 million who watched the Super Bowl premiere, but it was a strong, healthy number for a primetime animated show. Season 20 averaged just 1.31 million viewers. Season 23 averaged 723,000 viewers, a number that was smaller than the population of many individual American cities. The network's treatment of the show reflects this reality. For most of its run, Family Guy was the centerpiece of Fox's Sunday night animation domination block, sharing the night with The Simpsons and occupying a position of prestige on the schedule. In 2019, it was moved from 9 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. on Sundays. A small shift, but a signal. In the 2023 to 2024 season, it was moved off Sunday nights entirely. Family Guy and Bob's Burgers were removed from the animation domination block and relocated to Wednesday nights. It was the first time Family Guy had aired on a weekday since 2002, during its original troubled run before the first cancellation. Wednesday nights are quieter territory. The audience is smaller, the expectations are lower. Being moved to Wednesday is television's way of saying the show is still worth keeping but no longer worth protecting. And yet it continues. The reason it continues is economics. Animated shows are significantly cheaper to produce than live-action shows. There are no physical sets to build and maintain, no large casts of actors who need to be housed and transported and fed. The voice actors record their lines individually in recording studios and never need to be in the same room together. The animation work is distributed across studios in multiple countries. The whole operation is lean in a way that live-action television simply isn't, which means the break-even point is much lower. Family Guy can remain profitable at audience numbers that would have canceled a live-action drama years ago. Beyond the production economics, the show has an enormous secondary market. It airs in reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and various other cable outlets. It streams on Hulu. It generates ongoing merchandise revenue from apparel, toys, video games, and the broad licensing ecosystem that builds up around a recognizable brand over decades. The money that Family Guy makes does not come primarily from first-run viewership on Wednesday nights on Fox. It comes from the entire infrastructure of content and licensing that 25 years of production has built. Family Guy was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009. This was historically significant in a way that can't be overstated. It was the first time an animated series had received that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961. Not The Simpsons, which had already been on the air for 20 years at that point, and was the most critically celebrated animated comedy in the medium's history. Not South Park, which had been stirring cultural conversations for over a decade. Family Guy in 2009. That achievement belongs to a version of the show that no longer exists in the way it did then. In 2013, TV Guide ranked Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. Whether you agree with that ranking or not, the critical standing it represents was real. People in positions of critical authority took the show seriously as a creative achievement. The show still has defenders, and those defenders are not wrong in the things they point to. There are episodes in the recent seasons that work. There are individual performances from the voice cast that are as good as anything they've ever done. There are moments of genuine surprise, occasional flashes of the specific intelligence that made the early show extraordinary. Seth MacFarlane can still make Stewie or Brian say something that cuts right to the heart of whatever they're going through, and when he does it, you remember why these characters existed in the first place. The larger question, the one that the show's entire history sits underneath, is what it means for something to stay alive past the point where the creative passion that created it has moved on. Family Guy was built from a specific vision, a specific sense of humor, a specific set of relationships between characters who felt like real people, even when they were doing impossible things. That vision belonged to Seth MacFarlane, and when MacFarlane's attention shifted to other things, the show continued but the vision became diffuse. What it is now is something that has outlasted its own reasons for existing. It is still technically Family Guy. The characters have the same names and roughly the same appearances and some of the same patterns. But the show that aired between 1999 and 2002, the one that built a passionate audience through Adult Swim reruns, the one that earned the Emmy nomination, that show lived in the specific intersection of MacFarlane's particular sensibility and the particular group of writers he had assembled, and the particular moment in television history when those elements came together. Everything since has been trying to reconstruct that intersection, sometimes successfully, mostly not entirely. None of this diminishes what Family Guy accomplished. It genuinely changed how animated comedy worked. It created a template for the cutaway gag format that influenced dozens of shows. It proved that animation didn't have to be a family medium and that adult animated comedy could sustain network primetime audiences. It launched careers, influenced a generation of comedy writers, and generated decades of cultural conversation. It survived things that kill shows twice and came back each time. That is a remarkable story. It is also ultimately a story about what gets lost when the thing doing the remarkable surviving is a show rather than a person. A show doesn't feel the wear the way a person does. It just keeps going until the economics say stop. Family Guy will keep going until 2029, maybe longer if the deal that was just signed has an option. By the time it finally stops, it will have been on television for 3 decades, through multiple cultural eras, through multiple versions of itself, through controversies that would have destroyed less stubborn institutions. Peter Griffin will still be crashing through walls. Stewie will still have that voice. Brian will still be reaching for things slightly beyond his grasp. And somewhere in the voice booth, Seth MacFarlane will sit down, put on his headphones, and say something as a character he created a very long time ago, before he knew what it would become. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. Thank you for spending this time here. If you've made it all the way through, you already know the drill. Drop a like if you found yourself learning something new, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Every single subscriber actually does make a difference to how these videos get made. See you in the next one. End of script. Word count target 30,000 plus words. Approximate spoken duration at 130 to 150 WPM. ASMR pace 3 to 3.5 hours. Expanded sections. Additional depth and detail. Section 1 extended. Building the world of Quahog. Going back to where we started, to Seth MacFarlane and that first draft of a world he was creating, there's so much more to examine about what made those initial creative decisions so specific and so enduring. The fictional town that became the setting for Family Guy went through several names and iterations before settling into something permanent. Rhode Island was a deliberate choice on MacFarlane's part. He had attended the Rhode Island School of Design and had a genuine affection for the state's specific geography and culture. Its blend of old New England architecture and blue-collar working-class communities, and the proximity to major cities without the overwhelming density of those cities. Setting a show about a working-class family in a small Rhode Island town gave it an immediate texture of place that distinguished it from the more generic suburban settings that other animated shows used. The name of the fictional city, a coastal bivalve shellfish, was the kind of quiet, deliberate joke that runs through the show's DNA. A clam. The entire town is named after a clam. The people who live there exist in a place with a ridiculous name and they never think about it. The show even built an entire mythology around the town, with recurring locations and local institutions and historical references that deepened over the seasons. The Drunken Clam Bar, the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, James Woods Regional High School, the local news broadcast with Tom Tucker and Trisha Takanawa, These details accumulated over time into something that actually felt like a place, which is a significant creative achievement for a show that was also capable of casually ignoring its own continuity from episode to episode. The Griffin House itself, the blue and white colonial at 31 Spooner Street, is a visual anchor that has appeared in every episode across the entire run. The layout of the house has been established and re-established across hundreds of episodes, and while the exact dimensions seem to shift whenever the plot requires it, there is a specific visual identity to it that makes it immediately recognizable. The living room, the kitchen, Peter's chair, the stairs leading to the bedrooms, the backyard where various absurdities unfold. These spaces are the physical grammar of the show. MacFarlane's original 15-minute pilot, the one he made for $50,000 with Fox's initial development money, established the visual style and the character relationships in a compressed form. The pilot exists, and people who have seen it describe it as rougher and faster than the broadcast episodes, with some character designs that are noticeably different from what appeared on screen. MacFarlane has described the pilot process as a period of intense creative compression, making every decision quickly because there was no time or money to second-guess anything. One of the most interesting things about the show's original run is how seriously it took its own internal logic in ways that the later seasons would abandon. In the first 3 seasons, there was a consistent question about who could understand Stewie and who couldn't. Most adults seemed to hear nothing but babbling when Stewie spoke. Brian was the main exception, the one character who could have real conversations with him. This created layers of comedy that worked because the rules were consistent. The audience knew something the characters didn't. Stewie would deliver an elaborate threat or a detailed plan, and the person standing right next to him would smile and offer him a cracker. As the show went on, the rules around Stewie's comprehensibility loosened considerably. In later seasons, it became inconsistent and often irrelevant, with characters sometimes responding directly to things Stewie said and sometimes apparently not hearing him, with no clear logic governing which applied. This is a small thing, but it's representative of a broader pattern. The show's internal consistency mattered more in the early seasons than it did later, and the loss of that consistency was part of what made the world feel less like a place and more like a set of disconnected sketches. The relationship between the Griffin family and the broader community of their neighborhood was more developed in the early seasons than most people remember. The Swansons next door, the Browns on the other side, Quagmire down the street. These were genuinely integrated into the fabric of the show, characters who had their own lives and histories that intersected with the Griffins in meaningful ways. Joe Swanson's career as a police officer was used for actual storytelling in the early seasons. Cleveland Brown's gentleness served as a contrast to the broader chaos around him. Quagmire's promiscuity was a character trait that generated genuine comedy, rather than just a one-note punchline. The pilot that MacFarlane delivered to Fox also contained an element that would become central to the show's identity, but that could easily have been removed. The musical numbers. MacFarlane's genuine passion for musical theater and classic American songwriting found expression in Family Guy from the very beginning, with songs worked into episodes not just as gags but as actual musical moments with real production value. The show employed a live orchestra, recording at the Newman Soundstage on the 20th Century Fox lot in Los Angeles. This is not a budget-saving measure. A live orchestra is expensive, but it created a musical richness in Family Guy's score that most animated shows couldn't match, and it gave MacFarlane a vehicle for the musical passion that runs as a parallel track through his entire career. The original development money Fox gave MacFarlane was $50,000 for the 15-minute pilot. That is a genuinely small amount of money for a network television pilot, even in the late 1990s. MacFarlane has described this period as being intensely frugal and creative under severe constraint. Every dollar had to go directly toward the material on screen because there was nothing left over for anything else. There is an argument that this constraint was actually productive, that it forced choices and discipline that shaped the show's voice in ways that a larger budget might not have. The full series order that followed the pilot gave the production considerably more resources, though Family Guy has never been a big-budget show by Hollywood standards. Estimates for later-era episodes place the cost per episode in the range of $2 to $3 million, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to live-action dramas that regularly cost 3 to 5 times that amount per episode. The economics of animation have always been what made the show viable at audience levels that would have canceled a live-action production, and those same economics have kept it alive into territory where the ratings would normally end any other show's run. Section 2 Extended: The Adult Swim Era and What It Meant. The story of Family Guy's revival through Adult Swim reruns is worth lingering on because it reveals something important about how television actually works and how audiences build around shows that aren't being served by the traditional broadcast system. Adult Swim launched in 2001 on Cartoon Network, designed to occupy the late-night hours with programming aimed at adults. The block was a genuinely novel idea at the time. Cartoon Network was, in most people's minds, a channel for children. Transforming those same channels into an adult destination after a certain hour required a specific kind of programming that had edge and irony and cultural awareness. The original Adult Swim lineup included shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force and Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, and Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which had actually been an early precursor to the whole enterprise. These were shows that operated with the visual language of animation, but with adult sensibilities and humor. Family Guy fit into this ecosystem perfectly. By the time it arrived on Adult Swim in April of 2003, the audience that Adult Swim had been building was primed for exactly what Family Guy offered. The show was edgier than broadcast standards had allowed it to be in prime time, funnier in ways that cut against the family-friendly expectations of animation, and built around characters that felt like real people rather than archetypes. The growth was extraordinary fast. Within weeks of Family Guy's Adult Swim premiere, the block's ratings had shifted dramatically. The show was being watched by the exact demographic that Adult Swim needed to establish itself as a serious player in the late-night cable landscape. Young adults in their late teens and 20s who stayed up late and had strong opinions about entertainment and shared things they loved through word of mouth with intensity. This was 2003, before social media in any recognizable form. Facebook launched in 2004. Twitter didn't exist until 2006. YouTube launched in 2005. The conversations about Family Guy happening in 2003 were happening in dorm rooms and on early internet forums and through actual conversation. Someone who loved the show told someone else. That person watched it and told others. The audience built the way audiences built before algorithmic recommendation, through genuine enthusiasm propagating through real social networks rather than digital ones. The DVD situation ran in parallel with the Adult Swim phenomenon. The DVD sets for the first and second seasons were released into a market where the show had been canceled and appeared to be dead. Nobody expected strong sales. The sets were priced competitively and stocked in stores without any particular promotional push. And then they sold. Not just well, but remarkably. The first DVD collection sold approximately 2.8 million copies in total, a figure that was frequently cited in the conversations about why Fox decided to bring the show back. What those DVD sales represented, beyond just revenue, was a signal about the depth of the fan base. People who buy a DVD set of a canceled show are not casual viewers. They are committed. They are spending money on something they want to own, something they want to watch again, something they believe in enough to make a deliberate purchase rather than waiting for a rerun. The combination of massive Adult Swim ratings and 2.8 million DVD sales was an argument that was hard to ignore. Fox had a property that people genuinely loved and were actively seeking out even after the network had decided to let it go. The lesson that this period teaches about television economics and audience loyalty is one that was being internalized by the industry in real time during these years. The traditional model, where a network decided what was good by measuring who was watching live on broadcast at a specific time, was already beginning to show its limitations. The Family Guy revival was an early example of what happens when you allow for a more complete picture of how people actually engage with entertainment. The show was failing on one very narrow metric: live broadcast viewership in contested time slots, while succeeding on every other measure of genuine cultural resonance. Fox's decision to bring the show back in 2004 was framed as responding to fan demand, and in a sense it was. But it was also responding to financial logic. The Adult Swim deal was bringing in money. The DVD sales were bringing in money. A show that was generating this much revenue as a canceled property would obviously generate more if it were producing new episodes that could be sold on DVD and that would drive additional Adult Swim viewership. The emotional framing, that Family Guy was coming back because the fans believed in it and fought for it, is not false. The passion was real, but the institutional decision was made for institutional reasons. And the romantic version of the story where a show comes back from death purely because people loved it leaves out the part where the financial arithmetic had to support the decision. Still, it happened. The show came back. And for a period of time, the reunion between the show and its audience was genuinely joyful. Section 3 Extended: The creative ecosystem and how it worked. The actual mechanism by which Family Guy got made, episode by episode, season by season, is more complex than most audiences imagine, and understanding it helps explain some of the creative patterns that developed over the show's run. Each episode begins in the writer's room, which for Family Guy is a large group of writers who pitch ideas and develop them collaboratively. MacFarlane has described this process as chaotic and fast-moving, with jokes and story ideas thrown out at rapid pace, and the good ones surviving through a kind of Darwinian selection. The writer's room was, in the early seasons, personally overseen by MacFarlane in a hands-on way that gave it a specific character. His taste determined what made it through, and his taste was informed by the full depth of his entertainment background. The table read process, mentioned in the casting section, is a specific checkpoint in the production pipeline where the script is performed aloud for an audience that includes people from outside the writing staff. The explicit purpose is to test the material against reactions from people who didn't help create it. Comedy that works in the abstract, in the minds of the people who wrote it, doesn't always translate to actual laughter when heard by someone encountering it fresh. The table read catches the gap. From the table read, scripts go through additional revision before entering the animation pipeline. And this is where the timeline becomes genuinely surprising. MacFarlane revealed in a 2026 interview with the podcast Pardon My Take that each episode takes approximately 10 months to a year to produce. He was clear that this is the total production timeline from initial development to air date, with multiple episodes at different stages simultaneously, rather than the whole staff working on one episode for a year. But the figure still captures something real about the complexity of the process. For the animation to work frame by frame, with each movement and expression needing to be specified on what is called an exposure sheet, an enormous amount of information has to be communicated between the producers in Los Angeles and the animation studios that handle the actual drawing work. Family Guy's animation has been produced by studios in various countries over the years, with the work moving through different hands at different stages. The overseas animation pipeline means that communication has to be extremely precise, because a misunderstood instruction at the keyframe stage becomes a fixed visual choice that affects the whole scene. MacFarlane pointed out in the same interview that the difference between animation and live action is the difference between capturing a performance and constructing one. In live action, an actor makes a face and the camera records it. In animation, the production team has to decide what the face looks like and then specify, frame by frame, how it gets there. What is the tone of the scene? Is the character dismissive or pleading? Each of those emotional notes requires different animation choices, and each of those choices has to be articulated explicitly enough that someone who was not in the writer's room when the script was written can draw it correctly. The music element adds another layer of complexity. Family Guy employs a live orchestra, which is unusual for animation and expensive. Walter Murphy, the show's composer since its earliest seasons, creates original scores for each episode rather than using library music. The cost is higher and the process is longer, but the result is a musical texture that distinguishes Family Guy from most of its competitors. When a scene in Family Guy feels emotionally larger than you expect, part of what you're responding to is the specific quality of the orchestral score underneath it. The pilot took 6 months to complete. That was considered fast. A standard episode takes closer to 10 months. The production is running multiple episodes simultaneously in different stages, so the show can deliver a full season each year, but the internal pipeline is long, and any disruption, like a writer's strike, ripples through the production schedule in ways that can affect not just the current season, but the one after it. This production reality explains some things about Family Guy that casual viewers might not think about. Because episodes are produced so far in advance, jokes about current events can feel dated by the time they air. The writers do their best to lean toward material with longer shelf life, but anything tied to a specific political moment or news cycle is going to age faster than the production timeline allows. This is particularly acute for topical humor, which is part of why the show's political commentary has sometimes felt flat by the time it reached broadcast. The joke about something that was happening 10 months ago, delivered in the present tense, lacks the immediacy that gave it energy when it was written. The budget figure that gets cited most often for Family Guy, in its middle and later seasons, is approximately $2 to $3 million per episode. Voice actors in their prime contract periods were reportedly making up to $300,000 per episode each, which across 4 principal cast members plus MacFarlane's own participation represents a significant portion of the overall budget. Add the live orchestra, the animation pipeline, the post-production work, the writing staff, and the production overhead, and you get a number that makes Family Guy one of the more expensive animated productions on television while still being dramatically cheaper than a typical live-action drama. Section 4 Extended. The casting stories that didn't make the show. The William H. Macy audition for Brian Griffin is the most famous near-miss in Family Guy casting history, but it's not the only one. The show's development process generated a number of decisions that could have sent it in entirely different directions. The original voice of Meg, Lacey Chabert, brought a very different energy to the character than Mila Kunis would later establish. Chabert was an established young actress who had real dramatic training, and her version of Meg had a more conventionally teenage quality to it. She was part of the show's first season, which means there are approximately 13 episodes of Family Guy out there where Meg sounds different. Those first season episodes are still in circulation, and the difference is noticeable to anyone who goes back to watch them after years of Kunis's interpretation. The transition between Chabert and Kunis happened in the second season, reportedly due to scheduling conflicts. Chabert was at that point balancing Family Guy with her regular role on Party of Five and various other projects, and the scheduling became incompatible. Kunis, who was 15 at the time of her original audition, and who had reportedly told the casting team she was 18 to avoid being turned away, stepped into the role from Holy Crap, the second episode of the second season. Her version of Meg, higher and more nasal and somehow more precisely miserable, became the definitive interpretation of the character so thoroughly that most long-term fans who went back and watched season 1 were surprised to discover how different it sounded. The story of MacFarlane's own vocal preparation for the 4 characters he voices is worth its own extended examination. Peter's voice is the one that gets the most attention because it is the loudest and most immediately present in any given episode. The slight New England working-class quality in Peter's speech, the specific way his vowels sit, is a deliberate construction that MacFarlane developed and has maintained for over 25 years. The voice has not changed significantly from season 1 to the current episodes, which is a remarkable consistency given how much the character himself changed. Stewie's voice carries within it the ghost of Rex Harrison, specifically the vocal quality Harrison deployed in My Fair Lady, the precise diction and the theatrical projection, and the slight hint of someone who believes themselves to be performing for an audience at all times. MacFarlane has said that this influence was conscious, that he was working from a specific reference rather than just finding a voice that sounded British and educated. The result is a voice that is immediately distinct from any other animated character and that carries a specific cultural weight, because anyone who knows My Fair Lady hears it differently when Stewie speaks. Brian's voice, closest to MacFarlane's natural register, is also the most flexible. The character of Brian allows MacFarlane to modulate into registers that the louder, more presentational Peter and Stewie voices don't permit. The dry wit in Brian's delivery, the specific timing of his observations, the way a pause before a comment functions as its own joke, these are tools that MacFarlane uses most freely with Brian because the character is built around intelligence and restraint rather than volume and declaration. Quagmire is the fourth, and it is the most stylized. The retro lounge quality of the voice, the slightly breathless quick-fire delivery, the specific way he emphasizes certain words, is a character study in mid-20th century American masculinity filtered through caricature. It is also probably the most fully removed from MacFarlane's natural voice, the most purely constructed, which is part of why it's fun to watch the actor occasionally shift between Quagmire and Peter or between Quagmire and Brian in interview settings. The distance between the two voices is genuinely striking. Patrick Warburton's approach to Joe Swanson is grounded in a specific kind of American machismo that Warburton has always excelled at deploying. His natural voice, that deep, authoritative baritone, was specifically designed for playing characters who project certainty and competence. Joe Swanson in the early seasons embodied exactly those qualities, a police officer in a wheelchair who had never lost the self-possession that characterized him before his injury. The comedy of Joe's position in the show's universe came from the gap between his projected authority and the often absurd situations he found himself in, and Warburton played both sides of that gap with precision. The ensemble chemistry between the voice cast is something that developed over years of working together, even though they rarely recorded in the same room. Voice actors for animated shows typically record their lines individually, in separate sessions, responding to the director's instructions, rather than to each other's live performances. The sense of genuine dynamic between characters like Peter and Brian, or between Stewie and Brian, is constructed in editing from individual performances that may have been recorded weeks apart. This is technically true of all animated shows, but it is still remarkable when you consider how natural the interactions feel, how much the characters seem to actually be present with each other. The physical separation of the recording process also means that the actors develop their characters in relative isolation from each other. MacFarlane is essentially developing 4 characters simultaneously, which requires him to maintain clear internal distinctions that prevent the voices from bleeding into each other or from reflecting each other's speech patterns in ways that would be inaccurate. Over 25 years, maintaining that clarity is its own form of discipline. Section 5 Extended. The full history of what couldn't air. The banned episode landscape of Family Guy is broader than most people realize. What most audiences know is the headline version. Partial Terms of Endearment never aired in the US, but the full catalog of material that was pulled, delayed, edited, or restricted is considerably larger and tells a more complete story about where the show's edges were and what happened when it ran into them. The earliest significant episode controversy involved Holy Crap, the episode from the second season that drew criticism from Catholic groups for its portrayal of a strict, unpleasant interpretation of Catholic faith through the character of Peter's father. Writer L. Brent Bozell III, who ran the Media Research Center, described the episode as promoting anti-Catholicism, and it generated enough complaint that Fox pulled it from the schedule, contributing to one of the several multi-month hiatuses that plagued the show's second season. The episode eventually aired, but the decision to pull it established a pattern of Fox making scheduling adjustments in response to religious content that would recur throughout the show's history. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein has a more complicated history than even the 3-year delay suggests. Fox held the episode from its originally intended 2000 air date for fears about anti-Semitism. The episode involves Peter becoming fixated on finding a Jewish financial advisor based on the stereotype that Jewish people are particularly gifted at managing money. MacFarlane's position was that the episode was actually engaging with and satirizing the stereotype, rather than endorsing it, that the point of the joke was to expose how absurd the assumption was. Fox's concern was that the execution was ambiguous enough that the satirical intent might not be legible to all viewers, and that the show could receive serious backlash. The lawsuit from the Bourne Company over the parody song I Need a Jew, which used the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star, was filed in October 2007. The lawsuit claimed that the parody had damaged the value and reputation of the original Disney song by associating it with offensive content. The legal question at the center of the case was where the line falls between permissible parody and copyright infringement, particularly when the parody transforms the tone of the original so completely. In March of 2009 U.S., District Judge Deborah Batts dismissed the lawsuit. The ruling found that Family Guy had not infringed copyright because the transformation of the song for clearly comedic and satirical purposes was protected under the fair use doctrine. The decision was notable for the clarity with which it articulated the legal protection for parody, specifically the finding that taking a famous song associated with innocence and hope and repurposing it for sharp comedy about cultural stereotypes constituted the kind of transformative use that copyright law is designed to protect. The Carol Burnett lawsuit was filed in March of 2007 and was one of the higher-profile legal actions the show ever faced. The season 4 episode Peterotica included an approximately 18-second scene depicting Carol Burnett's famous character, the Charwoman, as a janitor at an adult bookstore. The scene used what the lawsuit described as an altered version of the Carol Burnett Show theme music and showed characters performing Burnett's signature ear tug gesture. Burnett sought over $2 million in damages and also sought to have the references removed from the episode. The background to the lawsuit, which Burnett's legal team outlined, included the claim that Fox had approached Burnett in mid-2005 for permission to license her theme music, and she had declined. The suggestion embedded in the lawsuit was that the episode had been created in response to her refusal, as a form of retaliation through parody. Fox denied this characterization and pointed to Burnett's own long career of parodying public figures and celebrities on The Carol Burnett Show as evidence that she had benefited from exactly the kind of satirical latitude she was now trying to deny to Family Guy. In June of 2007, U.S. District Judge Dean Pregerson dismissed Burnett's case. The ruling relied on First Amendment protection for parody and found that Family Guy had the right to use recognizable elements of Burnett's character and theme in a comedic context. Pregerson's ruling included a pointed observation that public figures, such as Miss Burnett, are frequent targets of parodies and crude innuendo, noting that the specific kind of satirical exaggeration Family Guy deployed was constitutionally protected regardless of whether Burnett personally found it appropriate. Burnett received no compensation. The episode has continued to air with the scene intact. The Turban Cowboy situation deserves extended treatment because it illustrates something specific about how online misinformation can transform an already controversial piece of content into something different and more dangerous. The episode, as broadcast on the 17th of March 2013, had two separate, unconnected dark comedy elements in it: a cutaway gag where Peter drives his car through the Boston Marathon crowd, and a separate plot element involving a bomb planted on a bridge. These were not connected in the episode. They existed in different parts of the story and had no narrative relationship to each other. A social media user, in the immediate aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing on April 15th, took footage from these two separate parts of the episode and edited them together into a single clip that made it appear the episode had depicted a bombing at the Boston Marathon. The edited clip circulated rapidly, aided by conservative commentators including Alex Jones, who used it as fuel for conspiracy theories about the bombing itself. The suggestion was not just that Family Guy had predicted the attack, but in some versions of the conspiracy framing, that the episode was somehow connected to or predictive of a false flag operation. MacFarlane's response was firm and immediate. He called the edited clip abhorrent on social media and expressed clear sympathy for the bombing's victims. Fox pulled the episode from streaming platforms and announced it had no immediate plans to rebroadcast. The network also worked with YouTube to have the deceptively edited clip removed from that platform. What's notable about this episode beyond the immediate controversy is how it demonstrated the vulnerability of any piece of entertainment to malicious misrepresentation in an era when editing tools are widely available and social. Platforms can spread manipulated content faster than factual. Correction can follow. The original episode had not depicted a bombing at the Boston Marathon. The edited clip made it look like it had. By the time the factual clarification was available, the misinformation had already reached millions of people. The question of what the Turban Cowboy episode says about Family Guy's creative choices independent of the bombing controversy is also worth addressing. An episode that includes both a cutaway showing mass murder at the Boston Marathon and a plot involving a Muslim character who turns out to be a terrorist was going to attract criticism on its own terms, regardless of subsequent real-world events. The episode was reviewed critically even before the bombing, with some critics noting that it seemed to conflate Muslim identity with terrorist tendencies in ways that felt like lazy stereotyping rather than satirical comment. This criticism was, in several respects, separate from the controversy that erupted in April and would have existed whether or not the bombing had occurred. Section 6 Extended. The FCC and the Legal Battlefield. The relationship between Family Guy and American broadcast regulation deserves extended examination because it plays out as a kind of ongoing negotiation between the show's creators and the limits of what the First Amendment permits. On public airwaves. The FCC's indecency standard for broadcast television is specific. For a broadcast to be found legally indecent, the content must be patently offensive by contemporary community standards, must involve sexual or excretory activities or organs, and must be broadcast during specific hours, generally defined as between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. local time. Each element of this standard is a potential point of dispute. What constitutes patent offensiveness? What counts as a depiction of sexual activity versus a suggestion of it? What are the contemporary community standards against which the content is measured? The PTC's strategy was to push as many complaints as possible through the FCC system in order to force the Commission to act on the theory that sufficient volume of complaints would eventually translate into enforcement action. The strategy was partially successful in creating attention and potentially in discouraging some advertisers, but it produced very little in terms of actual FCC action against Family Guy specifically. The first indecency complaint about Family Guy that the FCC formally reviewed was related to a January 2005 rebroadcast of And the Wiener Is, a Season 2 episode. The FCC's review concluded that the episode did not meet the legal standard for indecency, specifically finding that the episode lacked the kind of explicit depiction or description that would satisfy the legal threshold. The complaint was dismissed. This pattern, complaint filed, FCC reviews, FCC dismisses, continued through numerous iterations across subsequent years. The FCC did file formal actions against other broadcasters for content violations during this period, most notably the large fine levied against CBS for the Super Bowl halftime show incident in 2004. But Family Guy, despite generating more complaints than almost any other show through the PTC's coordinated campaigns, did not face successful enforcement action. Part of the reason for this is likely the specificity of the indecency standard and the way Family Guy's content tends to operate. The show's humor often works through suggestion, implication, and reference rather than through explicit depiction. A joke about sexual activity that cuts away before showing anything explicit may be deeply offensive to many viewers without technically meeting the legal standard for indecency on broadcast television. The space between offensive and legally indecent is large, and Family Guy spent most of its run in that space. The show also had a structural defense that proved legally useful. Much of Family Guy's most controversial content appears in cutaway gags that are brief, disconnected from the main plot, and structured in ways that make attribution to specific characters or situations ambiguous. A gag that appears for 15 seconds in the middle of an unrelated storyline is harder to characterize as the show's endorsement of the content in that gag than a sustained plotline would be. The FCC's own reasoning in the And the Wiener Is dismissal cited the absence of explicit content alongside the absence of shocking, pandering, or titillating effect, suggesting that even the FCC recognized the difference between content that was trying to be offensive and content that was trying to be funny through uncomfortable material. The PTC's pressure on advertisers was a more pragmatic strategy than the regulatory complaints, and it produced more tangible results. Several significant advertisers reduced or eliminated their presence in Family Guy's broadcast time slot at various points, responding to organized letter campaigns and public pressure from the PTC. The economic pressure this created was real, even if it never succeeded in actually canceling the show. McFarlane has consistently described the show's approach to controversial content as principled rather than random. In a 2024 interview with the Los Angeles Times, he said that the writers try to approach every joke by asking whether they could defend it intellectually, whether there was a point being made beyond just the shock. This is a defensible standard, but it is also one that the show has not always met, particularly in the middle seasons when the drive for shock value was strongest and the satirical framework was weakest. Section 7 Extended: The Anatomy of the South Park Rivalry. The South Park criticism of Family Guy merits deeper examination because it isn't just about two shows not getting along. It is a crystallization of a genuine philosophical disagreement about what comedy is for and how it works. Parker and Stone's position, which they articulated most precisely in the commentary track for Cartoon Wars, is that comedy should be earned by the situation. A great joke is one where the setup and the punchline are organically connected, where the punchline feels both surprising and inevitable because it grows from something real. The humor in South Park, at its best, comes from taking real cultural phenomena and following their logic to absurd conclusions, from finding what is genuinely ridiculous about something most people accept uncritically. The Family Guy cutaway model, from Parker and Stone's perspective, represents a different philosophy. The cutaway gag typically goes like this. A character says something, and then the show transitions to a scene that bears only a thematic or associative relationship to what was just said. Peter says something reminds him of a situation, and then we see a version of that situation played out in a completely unrelated context. The humor comes not from the setup punchline relationship, but from the juxtaposition, from the gap between the serious thing happening in the main story and the absurd thing happening in the cutaway. Parker and Stone argued that this model required no real craft, that you could generate a functional Family Guy cutaway gag by randomly selecting elements from a list, and that any random selection would produce something sufficiently disconnected from context to work as a joke. This is the manatee metaphor, taken to its logical conclusion. McFarlane's implicit counterargument, embedded in his response in Spies Reminiscent of Us, is that the best prepared material is often funnier than improvised material, that the crafting of a specific joke for a specific moment produces a better result than trusting in organic emergence. The scene in that episode where Peter's pre-written gags generate enormous laughter, while more spontaneous performers fail, is a defense of the cutaway model, arguing that the construction of a good standalone gag is itself a form of artistry. Both sides of this argument have validity. The early Family Guy cutaways were often very good precisely because they were carefully constructed, specific visual jokes built around clear comedic concepts. The problem was not the format itself. The problem was what happened to the format as the show continued, as the writing staff changed, as the creative oversight became less concentrated. The later cutaways often were closer to the manatee model than the early ones, more random and less connected to anything specific, deployed as a way to fill time, rather than as a carefully crafted addition to a strong episode. The South Park writers, Parker and Stone noted, had reportedly received calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill after Cartoon Wars aired, thanking them for making the episode. This detail reveals something about the status dynamics of animated comedy in the mid-2000s. There were people working on shows that predated Family Guy, or developed alongside it, who felt that Family Guy's success had complicated how their work was perceived and discussed. Being lumped together with Family Guy was, for some of these writers, a slight, because they believed their shows operated at a different level of craft and the comparison felt inaccurate. McFarlane expressed confusion about this in his Rolling Stone interview, specifically the perception that there was animosity beyond just the creative disagreement. He seemed to genuinely not fully understand why Parker and Stone had the feelings toward Family Guy that they did, beyond the specific creative critique. Whether this reflects genuine confusion or a diplomatic reluctance to engage directly with the personal dimension of the rivalry is unclear. What the feud did over time was give Family Guy fans and critics a framework for thinking about the show's strengths and weaknesses. The question, is this cutaway a manatee joke or a real joke, became part of the vocabulary people used when analyzing the show. It gave language to a distinction that many viewers had felt intuitively but had not articulated. And the fact that the creators of South Park went on record to say they don't think the Family Guy writers work hard enough is a permanent part of the show's critical record, something that gets brought up every time anyone writes about Family Guy's place in the animated comedy landscape. Section 8 Extended. The cultural aftermath of Brian's death. The Brian Griffin death and resurrection story has implications that extend beyond the immediate episode controversy, and exploring those implications reveals something about how audiences engage with long-running characters in ways that blur the line between fictional and real attachment. The scale of the emotional response to Brian's death was genuinely surprising to everyone involved, including McFarlane. The Change.org petition grew past 100,000 signatures within days. It made national news. Entertainment publications that had been covering Family Guy primarily as a source of controversy found themselves writing about the show as an object of grief. Fan communities that had been openly critical of Brian's character development in recent seasons joined with the broader fan base in demanding his return, which suggests that the fundamental attachment to the character ran deeper than any particular frustration with how he had been written. This is one of the stranger aspects of long-running serialized entertainment. You can have genuine grievances with how a character has been treated by the writers, while simultaneously having a profound emotional investment in the character's continued existence. The two feelings are compatible. People who thought Brian had become insufferable still didn't want him to be dead, because dead was a different category of loss than written badly. You can be disappointed with a character while still caring about them, and you cannot care about someone who no longer exists. MacFarlane's admission that the team was surprised by the rage is itself revealing. It suggests that the show's creative staff had, to some degree, lost track of how strongly the audience still felt about Brian. That loss of awareness, the distance between the people making the show and the people watching it, is a symptom of the broader disconnection that had developed over years of production without the original creative vision driving every decision. The Vinny replacement was poorly received in part because of who voiced him. Tony Sirico, known for playing Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos, brought specific cultural associations to the character that were difficult to separate from the role. A rough Italian-American dog from a prestigious crime drama sitting in the Griffin household while the audience waited for Brian to come back was not a comfortable narrative space. Sirico was announced as being booked for only 6 episodes, which some fans took as a signal that Brian's return was always planned. The production schedule for animated shows, locked in months in advance, meant that Christmas Guy was probably already in production when Brian's death episode aired. The 3-week gap between Brian's death and his resurrection is, in production terms, extremely short. It is short enough that it raises real questions about whether the death was ever intended to be permanent. MacFarlane has been somewhat inconsistent on this point across different interviews. In some contexts, he has implied that the death was always meant to be reversed relatively quickly. In others, he has left open the possibility that stronger negative reaction might have led to a longer absence. What seems most likely, given what we know about how animated production works and given the timing of everything, is that the plan from the start was a brief, heavily publicized death that would generate attention, and then a resurrection that would capitalize on that attention to pull in viewers for the holiday episodes. The 3-week gap corresponds almost exactly with the Thanksgiving and early December sweep period, when networks pay particular attention to ratings. Brian dying just before Thanksgiving and coming back for Christmas is a narrative structure that serves a commercial purpose very precisely. The audience understood this. That is why the anger persisted beyond the relief of Brian's return. People were grateful he was back and simultaneously aware that they had been manipulated into demonstrating their own attachment through grief. The resolution of the stunt didn't erase the experience of the stunt. It completed the circuit while making very clear that the whole thing had been a circuit. Section 9 Extended, the archive of accidentally accurate jokes. The Kevin Spacey joke is the most famous example of Family Guy's dark comedy intersecting with real-world events in ways that proved uncomfortable in retrospect, but the show's archive contains multiple instances worth examining in detail. The way the show's cutaway gag format generates material creates the conditions for this kind of intersection more often than most other comedic formats would. When you combine random elements into non-sequitur jokes at the pace Family Guy operates, across hundreds of episodes spanning over 25 years, some of those combinations will land on real things. This is statistical probability rather than prescience, but the experience of encountering one of these moments without knowing the context for the joke can feel uncanny. The Spacey joke in particular had a specific quality that separated it from pure randomness. The joke was not just that Stewie had been in Spacey's basement. It was the implied meaning of the basement, the implication that something inappropriate had been happening there. For that specific association to have been available as a random cutaway in 2005, there had to have been something in the broader cultural conversation about Kevin Spacey that made the joke work at all. MacFarlane has described being told about an incident involving Spacey before the joke was cleared for broadcast, specifically the dog park incident that was apparently circulating in certain Los Angeles entertainment circles. The joke was not based on nothing. It was based on rumors that proved, years later, to have been connected to real patterns of behavior. The difference between the writers knew something specific and encoded it in a joke, and the writers had access to vague rumors that connected to real things they didn't fully know about, is the difference between the conspiracy interpretation and the mundane explanation. The mundane explanation is more likely, but the mundane explanation still involves the writers having information that the public didn't, using that information to write a joke, and having that joke land with retrospective accuracy that is genuinely uncomfortable. Other examples of Family Guy jokes intersecting awkwardly with real events have been cataloged by fans over the years. The 2013 episode April in Quahog included a joke about a future news broadcast, and some of the future items in that broadcast have been claimed by certain corners of internet culture to have predicted real events. Most of these claims require significant selective reading and chronological flexibility to support, but the pattern of looking for Family Guy as an oracle of future events has become a self-sustaining cultural phenomenon that the show neither intended nor can entirely control. The problem with this phenomenon is that it creates a perverse incentive structure. If people are going to mine Family Guy episodes for predictions, then any joke that happens to rhyme with something real will be framed as a prediction, regardless of how many similar jokes existed in the same episode that didn't rhyme with anything real. The archive of missed predictions is never compiled. Only the hits get cataloged. What the show's creators have been consistent about is that the writing process does not involve any kind of systematic attempt to encode predictions or warnings about future events. The cutaway format generates material at high volume. The table reads filter for what's funny, and what makes it on screen is what survived that process. Accuracy to future events is not a criterion at any stage of that process. Section 10. Extended. The depth behind the details. Family Guy's reputation for Easter eggs and hidden detail exists in a kind of tension with the South Park critique about randomness. If the humor is truly as thoughtless as the manatee metaphor suggests, there would be no deliberate hidden layers. The existence of those layers is evidence that real human attention went into the construction of individual episodes. One of the most sustained examples of this attention is the show's treatment of its own history. Family Guy has been self-referential from the beginning, in ways that reward people who have watched from the start. In jokes about the show's earlier seasons, callbacks to specific episodes from years prior, references to characters and relationships that would be meaningful only to long-term viewers, these accumulate into a texture of shared history that the audience participates in by remembering. The show has also embedded genuine artistic tributes within its format. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is often cited as evidence that Family Guy can do something more interesting than its reputation suggests. An episode with no cutaway gags, set entirely in a bank vault with two characters, drawing on influences from All in the Family and The Twilight Zone, and addressing Brian's depression with genuine directness. The episode earned its critical praise not by doing something familiar well, but by doing something completely unfamiliar and succeeding at it. The references in that episode to specific earlier scenes and episodes in the show's history were carefully constructed. The episode exists in dialogue with everything that came before it, using the characters' history together as the emotional foundation for what happens between them in the vault. This is exactly the kind of writing that the South Park critique says Family Guy doesn't do. The red drum blocks in Stewie's room, the newspaper headline that acknowledges DVD pausing fans, the Gumball 2 Gumball reference to McFarlane's first Fox pitch, the Stewie Griffin Untold Story DVD visible in Brian's yard sale items, all of these are acts of intentional meaning-making. They are gifts to careful viewers. They are evidence of a production that is paying attention to itself. The tradition of Easter eggs in animation goes back to the earliest days of the form, when individual animators would hide small images or jokes in backgrounds that would only be visible to someone watching frame by frame. Disney animators famously hid inappropriate images in certain features during the 1990s, whether deliberately or as part of an urban legend that grew beyond its actual factual grounding. Family Guy's Easter eggs are generally more legible than hidden frames in a Disney film, but the tradition is the same. People who love the craft finding ways to leave traces for people who love it back. The cast's hidden contributions are particularly rich. The connection between Seth Green's audition impression and the later episode referencing it creates a kind of authorial loop that is genuinely clever. An actor brings his specific talents to a character, those talents become part of the character's identity in the viewer's mind, and the show eventually acknowledges that identity by making the specific talent part of the character's fictional history. The Silence of the Lambs dance becoming something Chris Griffin actually does, because Seth Green is the person who got the role by doing it in the audition, is the show swallowing its own tail in a way that rewards exactly the right kind of attention. Section 11 Extended. The full scope of the character changes. The Flanderization of Family Guy's main cast is a topic that deserves more precise mapping than it usually receives, because the changes didn't happen uniformly or at the same rate or for the same reasons. Peter's deterioration is the most discussed, but the most gradual. You can watch his first appearance and his appearance 20 seasons later and see clearly what changed. But if you watch sequentially from beginning to end, the change is almost invisible from episode to episode. This is what makes Flanderization effective as a slow process. No single episode represents a breaking point. The character who laughed warmly at his daughter's embarrassing school play in Season 2 and the character who actively works to humiliate his daughter in Season 11 are separated by hundreds of episodes of incremental drift. The specific mechanism of Peter's deterioration is worth examining. The early Peter made bad decisions from good intentions. He wanted to help, but his methods were catastrophically wrong. The comedy of this is the comedy of someone who is trying and failing in recognizable ways. Everyone has made a bad decision out of good intentions. Everyone has caused harm because they didn't think something through. Peter's early disasters were funny because they were relatable escalations of universal human failure. The later Peter had what you might call the intentions surgically removed. The bad decisions remain, but the good intentions that made them human are gone. What's left is someone who makes bad decisions because he doesn't care about anyone else's well-being, which is a fundamentally different comedic premise. The humor of cruelty is a different kind of humor than the humor of incompetence, and many viewers find the former much harder to enjoy without a redemptive frame. Lois's character arc in parallel with Peter's is less frequently discussed, but equally significant. Early Lois was the center of gravity for the household, the person whose emotional intelligence held the family together even as chaos unfolded around her. She was capable of being sharp and funny in her own right, with a dry wit that surfaced in her interactions with Peter and with the broader world. She was also given moments of genuine vulnerability, glimpses of the life she might have had, and the choices she'd made in choosing Peter and the path her life had taken. The later Lois became less consistent and less defined. Her patience with Peter shifted from something rooted in genuine love through frustration to something that often looked more like resignation or indifference. The warmth that had characterized the early Lois and Peter relationship, the sense that underneath all the chaos they genuinely liked each other, became less visible over time. Lois could be cool or dismissive or occasionally cruel in ways that felt disconnected from the person she had been established as being. Chris Griffin's arc is the quietest, partly because Chris was never the most prominent character, and partly because his particular form of gentle cluelessness was harder to distort into something dark. The character remained roughly consistent through most of the show's run, which is either a sign of careful character stewardship or simply the result of the writers not finding Chris interesting enough to mess with significantly. The result is that Chris in Season 20 is more recognizable as the person he was in Season 2 than almost any other character in the show, for better or worse. The Joe Swanson arc represents a specific kind of change that is more about how the character is treated by the show than about who the character fundamentally is. Early Joe was admirable. He was the guy everyone wanted to be. Peter was jealous of him. That jealousy was played as comedy, but it was comedy grounded in genuine respect for Joe's qualities. Late Joe became more of a figure of pity and occasional mockery, his disability shifting from being a character trait that defined his resilience to being a source of jokes at his expense. The change in how the show positioned Joe mirrors the broader change in Family Guy's relationship with its own characters, from affection expressed through comedy to something more distanced and occasionally cruel. The question of what happened to Quagmire's character is complicated by the fact that Quagmire never had a character in the same sense as Peter or Brian or Stewie. He was always a caricature rather than a character, a concentrated embodiment of a specific kind of predatory masculinity that the show used for comedy without ever fully interrogating. The moments where Quagmire is positioned as a voice of reason, as in the Brian speech from Season 8, are interesting precisely because they put moral observation in the mouth of a character who is himself morally indefensible by any serious standard. The show used Quagmire's awareness of Brian's failures as comedy while apparently not registering the irony that the person delivering that awareness was himself defined by behavior considerably worse than anything Brian ever did. Section 12 extended. The full picture of where the show stands. Family Guy in 2026, as this script is written, occupies a strange position in the cultural landscape. It is simultaneously a cultural institution and a show whose moment has passed. These two things are not contradictory. They describe different aspects of the same reality. As a cultural institution, Family Guy's contributions are real and significant. It changed the template for adult animated comedy in ways that shaped everything that came after it. The cutaway gag format, whatever its critics say, created a model that influenced dozens of shows across multiple networks. The willingness to engage with controversial subject matter directly, to make jokes about things that other shows were careful to avoid, established an expectation for adult animation that still defines the genre. The show launched careers, created cultural references that people still use, and maintained an audience large enough to stay on the air for nearly 3 decades. As a show whose moment has passed, the ratings tell their own story. From 22 million viewers for the premiere to 723,000 for season 23 is a decline that no amount of secondary market revenue or streaming performance fully obscures. The show that was once a centerpiece of Fox's Sunday night primetime is now airing on Wednesday nights, with expectations that match those numbers. The culture that Family Guy both reflected and helped shape has moved on in ways that the show has not fully tracked. There is one particularly revealing data point about Family Guy's current cultural position. In its early years, Family Guy was a show that other shows responded to. South Park made a 2-part episode about it. The cultural conversation about what Family Guy was doing and whether it was good for comedy was a genuine ongoing debate. Today, that debate has largely concluded, not with a verdict but with a kind of exhaustion. People have stopped arguing about Family Guy and started simply accepting it as a fixture of the television landscape that will continue to exist because the economics support its existence. That is a different kind of cultural position than being a show that people fight about. Being fought about means you still matter enough to generate strong feelings. Being accepted as a fixture means something different. It means the show has been placed in a category alongside other enduring institutions that persist because they always have, because stopping them would require more energy than letting them continue. The renewed deal through 2029 confirms this reading. Disney, which now owns the property through its acquisition of Fox's entertainment assets, made a calculation that Family Guy's secondary market value, its streaming numbers, its licensing revenue, and its brand recognition justified locking it in for 4 more seasons regardless of what the first-run ratings looked like. This is a corporate decision made on financial grounds. It has almost nothing to do with whether any particular episode is good. MacFarlane's 2024 comment that the show had reached escape velocity is the most honest description of what Family Guy has become. Escape velocity is the speed at which an object breaks free from gravitational pull and continues moving without the force that originally launched it. Applied to television, it describes a show that has been going long enough that its momentum carries it forward, independent of the energy that got it started. Family Guy is no longer sustained by Seth MacFarlane's creative passion. It is sustained by its own mass and the infrastructure that has grown up around it. The show that this process has produced is not without value. There are still skilled writers working on Family Guy, still talented performers giving life to these characters, still individual episodes that manage to be genuinely funny or surprisingly moving. The talent has not entirely deserted the enterprise. What has changed is the orientation of the enterprise, from something made because the people involved believed in it and wanted to make it as good as it could be, to something made because the economics of stopping are more complicated than the economics of continuing. Seth MacFarlane in 1998, pitching a 15-minute pilot to Fox with $50,000 and the belief that he had something worth making, was not thinking about escape velocity. He was thinking about whether the jokes were funny and whether the characters felt real and whether he could build something that would make people laugh. Those questions drove everything in the early seasons. They drove the attention to detail, the warmth underneath the chaos, the characters who felt like people you actually knew. That MacFarlane is still somewhere in the building, still voicing the characters, still technically the name attached to the enterprise. The distance between that person and the show currently airing is the whole story of Family Guy in one image. Family Guy premiered when the internet was still a novelty, when DVR didn't exist, when streaming was not a word anyone used to describe how you watch television, when social media was a decade away from existence. It has survived through every transformation of how entertainment is made and distributed and consumed. It has survived cancellation twice, and the loss of its original creative center, and the decline of its audience, and the movement from Sunday primetime to Wednesday nights. What it has become is the longest possible version of what it started as. Not better, not worse. Longer, more episodes, more cutaway gags, more characters, more controversies, more lawsuits, more fan petitions, more debates about whether the current version honors the original vision. The original vision is still there, preserved in those first 3 seasons, available to watch anytime. Clean, warm, funny, specific. The show that MacFarlane built before it became an institution. The show that 22 million people watched after the Super Bowl in 1999 and kept watching until the network pulled it, and then found again on Adult Swim at midnight and fell in love with all over again. That version of Family Guy is genuinely great. It is worth your time in a way that is not complicated by any of the subsequent history. Watch those first 3 seasons and you'll see why the show mattered, why people fought to bring it back, why the revival felt like something worth celebrating. Everything that comes after those seasons is the story of what happens to something great when it outlives the conditions that made it great. And there is something worth watching in that story too, even if what you're watching is different from what you started with. Family Guy at 30, if it gets there, will have been part of the television landscape for longer than most people who are watching it have been alive. The show that started in a dorm room and ended up in everyone's home. The show that was canceled twice and came back both times. The show that started wars with its peers and lawsuits from its subjects and regulatory complaints from watchdog groups. The show that managed to be a genuine cultural force and a critical punching bag simultaneously. Whatever its failures, that is a remarkable story. It is a story about what television actually is, about how entertainment actually works, about what happens when a creative vision gets tested by success and time, and institutional pressure, and the slow grinding of decades. It is, in the end, a human story, about a young man who wanted to make something, and did, and about what happened to that thing when it went out into the world and became more than he could contain. That is the full story of Family Guy, or as full as any story about something still in progress can be. If you're still here, you've been a genuinely excellent companion for this one. Drop a like if something here surprised you, and subscribe if you want more nights like this. See you next time. End. Supplemental section. The music of Family Guy, a hidden legacy. One of the most consistently underappreciated aspects of Family Guy is its relationship with music, and this deserves its own extended treatment because it reveals something important about the people who made the show and about why the early seasons had a specific quality that is genuinely difficult to replicate. Seth MacFarlane's passion for American songbook music, for big band and jazz standards and the orchestral pop of the mid-20th century, is not a casual affectation. It runs through his entire career as a genuine creative commitment. He has released multiple solo albums. He has performed at Carnegie Hall. He has done tribute concerts to performers like Frank Sinatra. Now he has made his love of this musical tradition an explicit part of his public identity. What most casual viewers of Family Guy don't know is how deeply this passion is embedded in the show itself. The production employs a live orchestra, the Newman Soundstage on the 20th Century Fox lot, to record original music for every single episode. This is extraordinary. Most animated shows do not use a live orchestra. They use synthesized music, or licensed tracks, or a combination of both, because the cost and complexity of maintaining a full orchestra for a weekly television production is prohibitive. Family Guy does it anyway. The composer who has been with the show almost since its beginning is Walter Murphy. Murphy has a background in pop music arranging, most famously credited with a 1976 disco version of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony called A Fifth of Beethoven that became a genuine hit record. His work for Family Guy draws on his full range of influences, from classical to pop to jazz to musical theater, and the resulting scores have a richness that audiences feel even when they can't articulate why. The musical number sequences in Family Guy, where characters break into original songs, are particularly indebted to MacFarlane's theatrical sensibilities. The show has produced dozens of original songs across its run, from simple character comedy pieces to genuinely elaborate productions. Some of these songs have developed real cultural lives of their own outside the show, being referenced and shared and performed in non-show contexts. The variety of musical styles the show has employed, from vaudeville to contemporary pop to orchestral drama, reflects the breadth of McFarlane's actual musical knowledge. What the live orchestra contributes to the show is something that is hard to describe in precise terms, but is immediately audible when you compare Family Guy's musical texture to that of shows using purely digital music. Real instruments have a warmth and an imprecision that digital instruments cannot replicate, a slight variation in tone and timing that gives music a feeling of being made by people rather than by machines. This quality is part of what gives Family Guy's best emotional moments, their specific character. When the music swells under a scene that is trying to be genuinely moving, there is a real orchestra providing that support, and you can hear the difference. The use of specific musical references in the show is also intentional and precise in ways that reward musical education. A joke that plays with a specific piece of classical music or a specific theatrical convention is not just a random reference. It is a specific communication from someone who understands that music to an audience that might understand it too, and the reward for that audience is the pleasure of recognition. McFarlane clearly enjoys making jokes that operate on this kind of wavelength, that land differently depending on how much you know about the thing being referenced. The musical dimension of Family Guy is also one of the areas where the show's ASMR qualities are most active. For a script designed to be heard in a calm context, the music is part of the texture. The show's orchestral score, when you're listening rather than watching, creates a kind of ambient warmth that supports the storytelling without overwhelming it. This is not accidental. The specific choices about when music enters and exits, about what register of music is used for which kind of scene, reflect the deliberate craft of a composer who has been developing a sonic language for this world across hundreds of episodes. Supplemental section: The Road to Episodes and What Made Them Work. The Road to Episodes. The adventure specials featuring Brian and Stewie traveling to different places through various science fiction premises represent some of the clearest evidence that Family Guy at its best was a show with genuine creative ambition beyond the basic sitcom format. The first Road to episode, Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, established the template. Brian and Stewie are stranded together after a trip goes wrong, and the episode becomes a road movie about two unlikely companions navigating an unfamiliar situation. The comedy of the pairing works because the characters are genuinely interesting in different ways. Brian's world-weary intelligence against Stewie's theatrical grandiosity, two people who share an unusual degree of mutual comprehension and use it to needle each other with precision. What the Road to episodes discovered was that separating Brian and Stewie from the broader Griffin family context gave the writers freedom to develop the characters more deeply than the episodic sitcom format normally allowed. Without Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris to orbit, without the established rhythms of the Griffin household as a structural anchor, the episodes could explore Brian and Stewie as people rather than as supporting players in someone else's story. Road to Europe in Season 4 sends them to the United Kingdom through a series of misadventures, and the episode has moments of genuine comedy that come from the cultural contrast between the characters' different expectations of what Europe would be like. Road to Rupert uses a classic road trip structure to explore the emotional dynamic between the two characters, specifically Stewie's attachment to his stuffed bear Rupert and what that attachment reveals about his emotional life. Road to Germany takes the World War II setting and uses it to explore both the historical material and the characters' friendship under pressure. The later Road to episodes maintain this format through increasing decades of other changes. Even as Peter became crueler and Brian became more insufferable in the regular episodes, the Road to episodes tended to treat both characters with more care. Brian in a Road to episode was often closer to his original character, thoughtful, loyal, capable of genuine warmth. Stewie in a Road to episode retained more of his intelligence and complexity than he did in episodes focused on his identity confusion. The format seemed to have a preserving effect on the characters. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 is frequently cited as one of the finest episodes the show ever produced. In it, Brian and Stewie travel through alternate versions of reality using a remote control device, visiting a Disney animated world, a Renaissance-era world, a Japanese anime world, and several others. Each alternate world is rendered in the specific visual language of its source material, which required enormous creative and technical effort from the animation team. The episode is a showcase for the show's production capabilities and for the writer's encyclopedic knowledge of different animation traditions. It is also genuinely funny in ways that don't rely on shock or cruelty, building its humor from the specific details of how each alternate world is depicted and how the characters interact with those details. The Road to episodes represent Family Guy's ability, when it chose to exercise that ability, to be a show about something other than shock and chaos. They are adventurous and warm and internally consistent in ways that the regular episodes increasingly were not. They are the clearest evidence that the talent required to make Family Guy great never fully disappeared. It just was not always being applied. Supplemental section: The legacy of the spin-offs. Family Guy generated several spin-off properties during its run, and examining these reveals something about the extent of Seth MacFarlane's creative empire and about how the Family Guy world expanded beyond its original boundaries. The most successful and longest-running spin-off is The Cleveland Show, which followed Cleveland Brown, one of the Griffin family's neighbors, after he moved back to his hometown in Virginia and started a new family. The show ran for 4 seasons from 2009 to 2013, with Mike Henry continuing to voice Cleveland. The Cleveland Show is generally considered a lesser entry in the MacFarlane animated universe, not without its moments, but lacking the specific spark that distinguished the shows it was derived from. It was canceled after its 4th season. American Dad, which launched simultaneously with Family Guy's revival in 2005, has already been discussed at length in this script, but its status as a de facto spin-off of MacFarlane's creative sensibility is worth acknowledging. American Dad was not spun off from Family Guy in any narrative sense, but it shares the same creator and several of the same behind-the-scenes creative personnel, and its trajectory over time has been compared to Family Guy's constantly and usually unfavorably to Family Guy. The fact that American Dad avoided the specific creative problems that damaged Family Guy speaks to specific choices made by that show's creative stewards that were different from the choices made at Family Guy. There was also an animated film, Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story, which was originally produced as a direct-to-DVD project in 2005, but was later re-edited and aired as 3 interconnected episodes of the series in Season 4. The film was released into a market hungry for Family Guy content in the immediate aftermath of the revival, and it sold well. The story focuses on Stewie discovering a person he believes to be his biological father, which gave the creative team an opportunity to explore the character's backstory. The film exists in a complicated canonical relationship with the series itself, with certain details from it having been either confirmed or contradicted by subsequent episodes. The relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons deserves its own acknowledgement as a cultural dynamic that shaped the show's history. The Simpsons premiered in December of 1989 and established the template for adult animated comedy in American primetime. By the time Family Guy arrived a decade later, The Simpsons was already a cultural institution. The comparison between the two shows was immediate and persistent. MacFarlane has been thoughtful in his public statements about the comparison, generally expressing genuine respect for The Simpsons while also asserting that Family Guy was doing something different enough to stand on its own terms. The 2014 crossover episode, The Simpsons Guy, where the Griffin family meets the Simpson family, was designed partly as a public acknowledgement of the relationship between the two shows. The episode was not universally beloved, but it was a rare moment where the comparison was made explicit on screen rather than existing only in critical discourse. The more important dimension of The Simpsons comparison is structural. The Simpsons at its peak achieved something that Family Guy at its peak was reaching toward: a combination of genuine emotional depth, specific character, psychology, cultural critique, and sustained comedic excellence that made it not just a popular show, but an important one. The Simpsons got there by building a world with genuine internal rules and relationships, by caring about its characters in ways that were visible in the writing, and by treating its audience as intelligent. Family Guy approached those qualities in its early seasons and then moved away from them. The Simpsons itself moved away from its own peak qualities over time, a fact that was a source of significant cultural debate throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Both shows exist in the later portions of their runs as diminished versions of what they once were. The difference is that The Simpsons' first 8 seasons or so represent an achievement in television comedy that very few things in the medium's history can match, while Family Guy's early excellence, genuine and real as it was, operated at a somewhat different level. What Family Guy achieved that was genuinely distinctive was the specific cultural moment it represented in the early to mid-2000s, the moment when online video sharing was beginning and the cutaway gag format turned out to be perfect content for a world of clips and shares. The show produced more viral moments per season than almost any other show of its era, and those moments built an international audience and a specific kind of cultural cachet that extended far beyond the show's American primetime ratings. Supplemental section: What the future holds. The announcement of the renewal through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season raises genuine questions about what the show will look like by the time it reaches that milestone. The 30th anniversary of Family Guy in January 2029 will be an opportunity for retrospectives and celebrations and the kind of cultural summation that attaches to round numbers. Whether anyone involved in the show will be in a position to look back with genuine pride at what it became, or with the kind of complicated feelings that attach to something you loved that went in directions you didn't fully anticipate, is a question that only the people involved can answer. What the show has already given the world is considerable. It provided employment to hundreds of writers and animators and voice actors over more than 2 decades. It generated enormous amounts of creative output, some of it excellent and some of it problematic, and most of it somewhere in the complicated middle territory that most creative work occupies. It influenced how animated comedy worked and how the industry thought about the audience for adult animation on broadcast television. It gave people something to watch late at night when they couldn't sleep. It gave people something to argue about. It gave people something to bond over. It gave people characters who felt real enough to grieve when they died, even briefly. Whether the show that airs in its 27th season retains any connection to the show that premiered in 1999 is an open question. The characters will have the same names and roughly the same appearance. The format will be recognizable. Seth MacFarlane will still be voicing Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire. But what those voices will be saying, what values will be embedded in the stories they're telling, what relationship the show will have to the world that created it and the audience that sustained it, those are genuinely unknowable. What is knowable is the original show. Go back and watch it. The first season, the second, the third. Watch what a young animator built when he had $50,000 and a network's attention and something genuine to say. Watch the warmth underneath the chaos and the love underneath the dysfunction. Watch a working-class dad who meant well even when he was causing chaos. Watch a talking dog who was trying to be taken seriously and kept falling short but kept trying. Watch a baby who wanted to conquer the world and couldn't get anyone to take him seriously. That show is a genuinely excellent piece of television. It is funny in ways that hold up. It cares about its characters in ways that are visible in every scene. It takes comedy seriously as an art form. Everything that came after it was built on that foundation. Not always faithfully, not always well, but the foundation is solid, and it is still there, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone who starts from the beginning and gives it the time it deserves. Family Guy, 30 years and counting, more complicated than its reputation, more accomplished than its critics allow, more diminished than its defenders admit, a show that burned bright, dimmed slowly, and keeps going anyway. Final word, final night, final moment. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you haven't, like if this delivered, and I'll see you in the next one. Script complete. Supplemental section: the show's relationship with real history and real people. Family Guy's willingness to engage with real historical events and real public figures has been one of its defining characteristics and one of its most persistent sources of controversy. The show treats almost nothing as off-limits from comedic engagement, which creates both its distinctive voice and its recurring problems. The approach to historical figures in Family Guy follows a pattern of aggressive irreverence that is consistent regardless of who is being depicted. Historical presidents, religious leaders, public intellectuals, celebrities both living and dead, political figures from every era, all have appeared in the show's universe and all have been subjected to the specific kind of satirical treatment that the writers developed over decades. The question that critics have raised repeatedly about this approach is whether the irreverence is doing genuine satirical work or whether it is simply being shocking about recognizable names, because recognizable names are easier to get a reaction from than invented ones. The show's treatment of Jesus Christ generated sustained controversy from religious groups, particularly the recurring depiction of Jesus as a character with human failings, romantic interests, and ordinary social anxieties. The episode The 2000-Year-Old Virgin from season 13 depicted Jesus visiting the Griffin household and emotionally manipulating people to help him achieve a romantic objective. The Media Research Center, one of the conservative media watchdog organizations, published strongly worded criticism of the episode. The Parents Television Council placed it among its designated worst of the week. Religious groups in multiple countries objected. McFarlane's consistent position on this material is that the show treats all religious figures with the same irreverent approach it takes to everything else, and that treating religion as exempt from satirical examination would itself be a kind of ideological statement. He has argued that the equal opportunity nature of the offense is the show's guarantee of consistency, that nothing is special enough to be protected from the Family Guy treatment. This argument has genuine intellectual merit and also genuine practical limitations. The concept of equal opportunity offense works as a theoretical principle, but in practice, the effects of making fun of different groups are not equal. Making fun of a dominant cultural institution is not the same as making fun of a marginalized group, even if the technical format of the joke is identical. Critics who have engaged with this dimension of Family Guy's offense catalog have noted that the show's equal opportunity framing sometimes obscures significant asymmetries in who bears the cost of the jokes. The show's engagement with actual current events is filtered through the production timeline in ways that create interesting artifacts. An episode written in response to something happening in the news will not air for 10 months, which means its topical humor has a built-in expiration mechanism. The writers try to hedge against this by focusing on patterns rather than specifics, but the result is sometimes a joke that landed in the writer's room and lands flat 10 months later because the specific moment it was responding to has passed. The political humor of the show has been a particular area of controversy because Family Guy has a clearly identifiable political perspective that has been consistent across most of its run. The show is liberal in its values and has been willing to make that liberalism explicit in a way that a show seeking the broadest possible audience might have avoided. Characters have expressed directly liberal positions on gun control, climate change, drug policy, LGBTQ rights, and numerous other contested political questions. Brian Griffin, in his role as the show's political mouthpiece, delivered these positions most directly, which was one of the sources of criticism of Brian's later characterization, since he came to feel more like a vehicle for political statements than a person with political views. The show's willingness to target real individuals by name has generated legal consequences beyond the Carol Burnett and Bourne Company lawsuits. Various other public figures have expressed displeasure at their treatment in the show, though most have not pursued formal legal action. The show has developed a kind of institutional awareness of where the legal lines are, reflected in the way certain jokes are constructed to maintain the protective cover of parody, rather than making straightforwardly defamatory claims. The involvement of real people as guest voices in the show adds another dimension to this. Family Guy has featured hundreds of celebrity guest appearances across its run, from major film actors to political figures to athletes to musicians. Many of these appearances involve the celebrity playing themselves or a version of themselves, which creates the specific kind of comedy that comes from watching a recognizable person engage with Family Guy's world. The show has been generally successful at getting celebrities to participate, which suggests that the entertainment industry broadly accepts the Family Guy brand of irreverence as a safe context for self-deprecating participation. Adam West's long-running role as the fictionalized mayor of the show's town remains one of the most affectionately received celebrity contributions in the show's history. West's willingness to engage with his own cultural status, to play a version of himself as an aging television icon who has become the leader of a fictional Rhode Island town, reflected a genuine generosity of spirit and a genuine sense of humor about his own career. The show's tribute to him following his death in 2017 was one of its genuinely emotional moments, an acknowledgement that his participation had meant something real to the people who made the show and not just to the audience. The relationship between Family Guy and its real-world subjects, the people it makes jokes about, and the events it engages with, is ultimately a relationship about power. Comedy has always been a form that allows the powerless to speak about the powerful, that gives people permission to say things in the form of jokes that would be unacceptable to say seriously. Family Guy has operated in this tradition, targeting authority and celebrity and cultural convention with the specific weapon of ridicule. When the show has done this well, it has produced comedy with genuine edge and genuine point. When it has done this poorly, it has produced material that punches in wrong directions or that mistakes visibility for satire. The full record of who Family Guy has targeted and how includes moments of genuine satirical precision alongside moments of lazy cruelty. This is probably true of any 30-year archive of comedy. The longer the production runs, the more the record reflects every variety of quality, from the genuinely excellent to the genuinely problematic, with most of it falling somewhere in the complicated middle. What the show leaves behind when it eventually does stop is that full record. Every joke, every banned episode, every lawsuit, every PTC complaint, every South Park parody, every fan petition, every moment of genuine excellence, and every moment of genuine failure. The complete archive of Family Guy is one of the most comprehensive documents we have of what American pop culture wanted from comedy across the first 3 decades of the 21st century. Not everything in that archive is defensible. Not everything is worth celebrating. But all of it is genuine. All of it came from real people with real intentions, trying to make something that would reach people and make them laugh, and occasionally make them think about something they hadn't thought about before. That is what Family Guy set out to do in 1999. That is what it was doing even in 2026. Whether it succeeded, episode by episode, season by season, is the question that viewers have been answering differently from each other for 25 years. The argument is still going. That might be the most Family Guy thing about Family Guy. And with that, we're done. All of it. Every controversy, every secret, every ban, every lawsuit, every stunt, every moment of greatness, every moment of failure. If you made it this far, you have genuinely excellent taste in how to spend a long night. Subscribe, leave a comment telling me what you're watching from and when, and I will see you in the next one.